Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing great today. If you want early access to all of my new videos, then make sure you check out my Patreon in the description where you can hear the MP3 version much earlier than the normal release. Make sure you check out the podcast in the description where I also add my videos in a few days after they've been uploaded to YouTube. The following isn't my own story, it's actually my father's. So my father worked as a fire lookout worker. Basically it meant that he spent a lot of time up in the fire towers, usually by himself, and he would have to patrol every so often around where his tower was, make sure no one was doing anything wrong, and mostly just keep an eye out for any fires. Now he'd done this job for a long time. He had a career that was at least 5 years long in this. He did other things too, but he said this was his absolute favourite thing in the world to do. He loved it when he could look around and not see anyone for miles. For myself, I think I'd get a lot more bored of this, but I guess back then it was more fun, because there wasn't as much to do, I suppose. Now my dad said that sometimes he would communicate with other workers in nearby fire towers with their radios. This was his most favourite thing to do because it could get lonely up there sometimes. He had a buddy, Ryan, who he would regularly communicate with. They would often work similar shifts, and they would actually go out drinking with each other sometimes when they weren't working, of course. Now in my dad's job, some nights he would have to stay up in the tower for quite a few days on his own. Again, this is something he had no problem with. However, he did have 2 or 3 scary stories that I'd like to share with you all. Now the first was on one particular evening. My dad says that it was extremely cold. He doesn't know why, it was just almost like the atmosphere was thicker, like when there's fog everywhere, but at the time there wasn't any. He said because of this, he had a very big heavy winter coat on, but he was also having issues with connecting to the radio correctly. Apparently there was some kind of moisture in the air, which meant the electronics, which were more simple back then, weren't working very well. So anyway, there's nothing much for my dad to see, and he decides to lay in his bed for a few minutes just to rest his back. At the time he was doing some drawings and needed to rest his eyes too. He did notice something rather odd though. He could see a light off in the distance. Now of course he grabs his binoculars and has to make sure there's no fire. As he does this, he realizes that he can't actually focus on whatever this is. It's a red color like a burning ember, but there's no smoke and it doesn't seem to be spreading. It doesn't seem to be too big too. My dad decides that he better go and investigate it, so grabs his coat and heads down. As he heads down, he realizes just how cold it is. He's annoyed because he has to leave his warm tower station and he can't be bothered to walk that far, but he has to do it because of course this is a part of his job. He realizes as soon as he gets down that he can't actually see where the fire or light is coming from. Of course this is a little bit concerning for my father because there could be a much bigger fire and maybe smoke's concealing it. But then again, surely he would have seen something by now. So as he heads off in the direction where he saw the light coming from, he gets a strange feeling that he's being watched that he just can't shake. He doesn't let this deter him, however, and he continues towards where the light is supposed to be. He wonders now if maybe his mind was playing tricks on him and it was where his eyes were strained, because he's walked out to nearly exactly where the fire or torch was and he literally can't see a thing. He takes a while to look around and just smell if there's anything burning. He can't smell a thing, and he realizes that he's come a long way from the tower now. Clearly there's nothing too pressing. My dad then decides to turn back. Just as he's walking away, he can hear a strange chanting sound in the distance, almost like somebody singing but more rhythmic. My dad says that it only lasts for 1 single second, but he's pretty sure he heard it. It could always be an illusion of his imagination, but he said it sounded too real. He's a little concerned now and decides to head back. While he's doing so, he's convincing himself that this is all in his mind and there's nothing to be worried about, and he heads back to the fire station. When he gets up to the fire station, he realizes something really odd. Now, there's not only one torch, exactly where my dad's just come from, but there's multiple, and they're all about exactly the same height. My dad then gets his binoculars and still can't differentiate exactly what he's seeing. He goes to radio it in to his buddy Ryan, but he can't get any signal because of the electronics playing up. He realizes this is quite a big issue now, because if there is actually a fire, he's not going to be able to let anyone know, and he'll have to quickly get into the truck and go over to the next station where Ryan is and let him know. Now, my dad's growing quite concerned at this point. He decides to step outside of the actual cabin windows of the fire tower for a closer look with the binoculars. As he does so, he realizes that something's off now. He can actually see clearly because the glass isn't distorting his view of whatever this is, and he notices that whatever this is seems to be holding up a torch. He can't make out exactly what it is because it's entirely black, but my dad realizes that there's at least 5 of these things now, all moving around very slowly with the torches. That's when it hits him. He held his breath for just a second, and he can hear the chanting again. Again, very rhythmic, but multiple now. My dad soon realizes that something's very wrong. What's worse is he has some of his lights on, and of course they're not going to know exactly where he is. So he quickly goes back inside and hits the light. He needs to be quiet, and he needs to not be seen for this moment. My dad lays down trying to figure out exactly what to do just outside of the cabin near the stairs. He quickly looks down, and thankfully there's none of them figures coming towards him. At first he thinks maybe there was some kids playing pranks on him, but why on earth would they be out here at this time, this far away from everything, where you can only get in trouble? He then sees 2 or 3 more lights appear, and eventually he realizes that there's 10 of these figures holding up the torches, and every so often he'll hear the chanting sound. Then, just as soon as it arrives, it fades out into the distance. My dad decides to be brave and hold his ground for as long as he possibly can, but he understands that he's now in a situation that maybe he can't deal with. "Ryan! Ryan!" he screams onto the radio, but doesn't get a response. All he can hear is static. My dad doesn't have any weapons with him, and he's now concerned for his life. Just how many of these things are there out here, and what do they want? He very hesitantly takes the first step towards his truck, but he realizes that he hasn't checked down the stairs. Maybe, just maybe, he's safer up the fire tower. But then again, what if they set fire to this with the torches, whatever they are? He remains there for what feels like an eternity, but says was probably only another 5 minutes. To his horror, he realizes that these figures are actually getting closer to him and his fire tower. He has no choice now but to go down. He's fighting with every step the urge to immediately run back up and just scream and lock himself in the top, but he knows he can't do it. He takes some very slow steps down, hoping not to be heard, but soon realizes that these things are picking up pace. He bolts down all of the stairs in what must have been record time, and he just makes it towards his truck. Just as he gets in the truck, he realizes that he doesn't have his keys with him and he has to go back up. He was so scared that he literally couldn't think straight. He then starts bolting it up the stairs again, and he luckily finds the keys. He's too scared to actually look up as to how close these things have got to him, and he just runs all the way back down. The moment he steps foot onto the ground again, he can hear them much closer this time, making a whispering sound. The torches have gone out, but he can actually figure out where they are by the sounds, and from what my dad told me, it couldn't have been more than 20 meters away. He quickly gets into the truck and drives as quick as he possibly can over to Ryan. He doesn't look behind him as he's peeling away, and he can hear something getting closer to him in the tree line as he's pulling away. He was too scared to even look to the side to figure out exactly what it could be. Again, in record time, he makes it over to the other fire tower, where his friend Ryan's angry at him for not answering any of the radio calls. He then explains exactly what happened, and Ryan goes pale as a ghost. Ryan explains that he too has spotted them before, but he was too scared to tell anyone in case they didn't believe him or thought he was going crazy. They ended up calling it into the station, and they launched an investigation to find out exactly what was out there. Unfortunately, they needed my dad and Ryan to be part of that, but they both agreed it was okay if they did most of it in the truck and let the other rangers take over and figure out what was going on. After hours of investigating, nobody could find anything. Luckily, another worker took over the tower for that day, and my dad still gets chills when he talks about it. He doesn't know exactly who or what it was out there, but the thing that scares him most is whatever these things were, they move far too quick to be human. He said it could just be because of the adrenaline and panic setting in, but he's honestly never seen anything like it. Another one of my father's stories is when he was working in the towers during one summer's evening. He said he kept on hearing suspicious noises around where he was set up during the day, and he thought it was just animals. He didn't know exactly what animal it was, but something kept on climbing up the steps, chewing part of the steps away, then running off with whatever food it could on the stairs or left around. My dad said he didn't mind and actually encouraged it, thinking it was probably a cute squirrel or something, leaving peanuts and whatnot. My dad always made sure that he didn't leave them too high up in case the thing fell, but he said he realised that in previous days, the trailings were getting progressively closer to where he was sleeping, and he thought it was pretty odd because one morning last week he had woken up to see some peanuts crunched on the floor right outside of the window where he was sleeping. After that, he decided to not do it anymore. So anyway, my dad kept on hearing noises but thought it was probably nothing, and just continued on with the rest of his shift. He was periodically checking around and reading and listening to the radio. It eventually comes to the next morning, and this is a very cold day in particular. My dad says that what he saw next is one of the most scary things that he ever saw in his life. He goes to open the door, and there's frost on all of the windows. Just as he does that, he can clearly see handprints outside of the door at human height. Also, he steps out to find the note saying, "Why no peanuts?" Of course my dad reported it, and they did some investigations but couldn't really find anything. They tried to tell him that it was kids playing a prank on him or maybe just a homeless person, but why would a homeless person be out there in the woods? And what kind of people would play a prank like that on my dad, where clearly they were going to get arrested for it and could get in big trouble or really hurt? My dad also doesn't understand how they got up the station so quietly. After this experience, my dad said that he always made sure the door was locked, and that he would never ever leave food out again, for animals or anything. My dad's final story isn't his own one, but actually his friend Ryan. Now you may recall me talking about Ryan in the first story. So basically, Ryan was stationed in another tower pretty close to my dad's, but you'd have to drive to get there in any kind of decent time. Now on one particular summer, my dad's friend Ryan realised that there was a fire, or at least the embers from one, and he has to go and investigate quickly. He radios it in, and he quickly goes down to get into his truck to try and drive over there and see how bad it is. He eventually gets to the source of the fire and realises that it's a huge blazing inferno. He couldn't see it too well because it was over a hill line, but he's very scared that this is going to spread badly, so he quickly tries to radio it in, but he can't get any signal on the walkie-talkie. He speeds in his truck to get back to his own fire tower, but He realises there's lots of smoke ahead. He rolls up the windows so he can continue breathing half-decent air. And just as he does so, he slams the truck to a halt. Up ahead, he can see his very own tower on fire, and the trees around it burning. He quickly drives off in the opposite direction to my dad's tower, and they call it in. Turns out there's an absolutely huge inferno, and it takes days for them to put out the fire. Luckily nobody was hurt from this, and they just think it occurred naturally. But one terrifying detail for Ryan is that his fire tower had collapsed due to the blaze, and had he have not left about 20 minutes sooner, fell asleep or anything, he would have died in the fire tower. I'd worked in the fire towers for a long time, and I wasn't really scared of much, but there was one particular thing that I can never forget, and still is kind of glued into my mind. So, on one particular area that we would go to, we would have lots of reports of a strange man with a backpack sprinting through the forest. We were sure he was homeless. That was until we realised from some of the other fire tower workers that this exact thing had been reported for over 50 years there. They even given him a nickname, the Cheetah, because he doesn't stop running. Now what's pretty scary about this is no one's ever seen his face or can actually confirm exactly what the hell it is. I did have a few times that I was stationed at night and I would actually hear some sounds rushing through the trees. I was convinced it was a bear, so I'd quickly go and get my mace, but every single time I went down, I would just capture the glimpse of something running off that was too small to be a bear, but big enough to be a person, and nothing more. I was convinced it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but who knows. Well, I guess I found out one particular evening. Now, I pretty much let it fall into the depths of my mind and presumed that this is just my mind playing tricks on me because hey, I can remember a time that I was stationed out here before where I'd driven up to my tower one day and I could see my tower on fire. I quickly turned around to see if there was any other signs of smoke, looked back and it was completely fine. It turned out that my mind had started playing tricks on me because I'd been on my own for so long, and I managed to get sent home for a few days to recover. But anyway, on this one particular evening, some other guys had radioed in that they had reports of somebody running through the forest. I assumed it was a homeless person or a lost hiker and was pretty worried, so I decided to investigate from the top of my tower. I have my binoculars out and I'm looking literally everywhere for any sign of this thing or person. And what do you know? I can't find anything. Just as I'm doing this, I pushed too far and I dropped my flashlight all the way down. It immediately goes out and I'm really annoyed. That was my main one with the spare battery in. I had no choice but to go down in the dark and investigate. Annoyed, I pull my binoculars to the side. I make my way down the steps and I have this strange feeling that I'm being watched. Just as I get to the very bottom of the stairs, I hear this strange screaming sound in the distance. I almost have a heart attack until I realise it must be an animal. But this sounded far too powerful and it almost went through me. I quickly reacted by grabbing my flashlight and realised that it's completely dead. Just as that happens, I hear a scream again. This time, fight or flight takes over and I drop the flashlight and I sprint all the way back up to the top of the tower and lock the door. I hate to admit it, but I actually barricade myself in, quickly call into the radio that something strange is happening, and cower there for about 5 minutes. I realise I have to investigate and convince myself I'm just being stupid. I grab my binoculars and feeling more confident now that help is on its way, I head down the stairs slowly. I can't actually see exactly where the flashlight is and I need to make it to the bottom. Just as I do that, I'm met with that running thing. It's exactly like it's been described to me. It's like somebody sprinting through the forest at full speed with a big backpack on, who's too dark to really make out exactly what they are. I've rubbed my eyes for a second thinking this can't be real, and just like that, it's gone. I decide I've seen far too much now, and quickly go back up the tower, and decide to ask how long the guys are gonna be. Just as I get up there, I can see a light off in the distance. It's not just any light, it's a flashlight. It's going far too quickly through the trees. I look through my binoculars, and I can just about see the slow fading out light of clearly a flashlight. I don't believe what's happening, and then, after sitting there in disbelief for what feels like an eternity, it was probably only 10 or so minutes when I hear my buddy's truck pull up with support. As I get down, I realise that that's my flashlight gone. I just start connecting the dots and say, what's happened? And one of the much older workers there says, hey, did that running guy steal your flashlight? Yeah, we kind of figured out when you called it in, don't worry about it. We don't know what this is too, but you'll be fine. Don't worry, one of us is going to stay here with you for tonight. I try to explain what's happened, but they all seem to be aware of it like they've encountered it before. I was convinced it was my mind playing tricks on me, but now, I don't really know what to think. I was too scared to even rest for the rest of the shift up in the tower, and they put me with a new guy who was also just as confused as I was. While we're up there, we can see the slow glow of the car driving off, and we both feel pretty scared now. Fortunately, nothing else happened, but to this day, I still have no idea what that thing was. I don't really believe in the paranormal, and I'd like to say it was my mind playing tricks on me, but why do so many of the other workers there know about this? Why has this been going on for so many years? I can never solve this, and I kind of don't want to because it scares me too much. When I first returned from the war, I was a power line rigger. This was on EHV lines, which are extra high voltage, the kind on top of the steel towers. Those are transitional lines, not sub-transitional like most inner city lines. So anyway, I had a job during a heavy windstorm in 2008 to go out and repair some lines near Colorado and the New Mexico border. It was great pay, since it was an emergency call out, so I agree. I met up with my crewman and head down from the Colorado Springs area. We get there at around 9 PM and start getting to work. Windstorms are notorious for failing lines, but not EHV or UHV lines, since they are rigged differently. When I crane up to see the broken link on the tower and inspect the damage, I remembered seeing over the tops of most trees. I observed the view for a moment and saw some nearby lights from a campfire. As soon as I saw the light, I hear yelling coming from that area. Now it must have been about 300 yards away, but I hear a woman yelling. She kept saying, "Someone please help," over and over again. I crane down and start yelling for the guys. They heard it too, and were asking questions. This is really odd. We never see anyone out there. I told them about the campfire lights coming from the direction our trucks were facing. We jump in one of the smaller trucks, since it's a 4x4, and head down the road. We look everywhere for the light, but don't see a thing. We drove back and forth, and then back again and slowed down. We rolled down the windows and stopped the truck in the area where the light should be. We all heard moaning sounds coming from the right of our trucks, so to the north. It sounded like two people are having heart attacks, and I mean really loud. So now, we're on edge. The site supervisor was calling the police now. Given the general area we're at, they told us to check to see if We feel safe. Because I have the war veteran attitude, I decide to look. 2 guys came down with me, and our supervisor stayed with the truck to wait for police. Apparently, they had a station not too far, like 15 minutes or so away. I armed myself with a pickaxe, and the other guys had conduit pipes like 1 inches. We all start walking through the trees with our headlamps on, because it got really dark now. The moaning's still coming from ahead of us. We got through the trees into a small clearing. It looks empty. The moaning stopped. We check around and hear nothing. We went back to the truck, and as soon as we got there, we heard the woman yelling again, yelling the same thing. "Someone please help." It was just to the north of where we were. One of the guys yelled back saying, "Where are you?" and gets no reply. Then, we hear her scream in pain, and nothing else. We're already running back north and call the police, but they've showed up. They must have seen us running north because 2 of them came after us. We stopped in the field area, and they stopped with us and asked what was going on. We told them. They helped us look around and saw nothing. We walked back to the truck and didn't hear anything else. They said they would hang out for us and check if anything else happened, so we get working again. The police are now parked next to each other, talking while we worked. When I craned up, I can't see any campfire lights or anything. We did the job. Took about an hour and a half until we're done. When we were packing our tools to head out, one of the cops left, and the other comes with us. He told us that, just to the west, there was a small plane that crashed, and people burned to death. He said the police and paramedics got to the scene, and the fire's still going. He told us about how 2 bodies were found away from the plane, crawling away from it. And one of the bodies is still there somewhere buried from the 70s or 80s. Yeah, we packed up fast and got the hell out of there. Now I never saw a fire, just light on the trees. Now I can't tell you how creepy that stuff is to find out afterwards. And the voices, the moans were so clear. I always kind of believed in the afterlife after this, but God, did it mess my head up. I'm so glad other people were there to experience it though. The cop believed us too. But I didn't hear anything about reports of a fire or anything else in the area afterwards. Back when I was a Boy Scout, I took a weekend-long training course called National Youth Leadership Training. One of the last parts of the course was an overnight hike into the woods, with no guide, to find our designated campsite and see how we would work under stress. We finally got to our campsite and began to unpack. We each bought a tent, but half of us left ours behind to lighten the load, and buddied up. Lo and behold, my buddy brought a 1-man tent only. Either I slept outside or things are going to be really cramped and I didn't want that. The sky was clear and I slept under the stars. The next morning, 4 of the other guys claimed that they saw a coyote walk up to me, sniff my face, stare at me, and leave. They were too scared to go and make it leave. They stuck to their guns though, but I didn't believe them. 4 years later, I was working at the camp as a staff member, and I'm speaking to a senior there, and apparently he said coyotes are pretty common there, and they often boldly show up. It made me realise what the guys were saying wasn't a lie. I just can't believe they let me sleep with a coyote literally at my face. God knows what would have happened if I'd woken up. I went camping with some friends near Lochmond in Scotland. We set up camp about 3 miles into the woods near a small river and got the fire going to cook some food we brought with us. The site is very remote, but in the evening, a couple of guys hiked through and stopped to chat with us. They're from Poland and seem friendly enough, but ask a lot of questions about our group, how many we were, etc. And I'm a bit suspicious, but I put it down to being from different cultures. It's around 10 PM. I start to feel very ill, and I'm thinking, is it possibly from food poisoning? Now, I'm very confused about this because I'm sure the food was cooked correctly. My friends are all pretty drunk, and I had drunk about 4 or 5 cans of Budweiser. Stupidly, I packed my bag after throwing up hard for 15 minutes and decided to hike back to the main road, watching light fading in the distance. I'm about a mile into the hike back. At this point, I've been sick twice and am completely sobered up by throwing up so much. I've got sports bottles full of water. I now stop to rinse my mouth out. At this point, it's near pitch black, so I got into my bag to get out my torch, small knife and my .22 air gun. As I start zipping my bag back up, I hear twig snap nearby and assume it's a rabbit or fox. I shine my torch, but there's nothing. This doesn't make sense because surely I'm at least going to see reflective eyes, but oh well. 5 minutes later, I hear what sounds like running, maybe 100 yards behind me, and lots of twigs snapping. I turn around and assume it's my friend, and I say, "Are you kidding me?" I said I knew someone's there, and I'm not joking. I see movement through the trees probably 80 feet away. Whatever this is big. I mean 6 or 7 feet tall and completely black. At this point, my sickness is gone, and my heart's beating through my chest. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I get this feeling that I can only describe as feeling almost dizzy at the surreal position that I found myself in. I take off my rucksack and hang it up. I kill my torch. I still think it's my friends, but I have this horrible feeling. It was too big. I've got my knife though in my jacket pocket, and my pistol gripped harder than I can possibly ever do normally. I walk in the darkness for about 100 yards, and stop dead behind a tree and wait. I'm trying my hardest to control my breathing, but it's supremely difficult now. Sure enough, I hear movement again. Very difficult to pinpoint, but it's getting closer. Now I'm caught in 2 minds, to continue to hide or confront. I decide the latter, and now I burst out from the brush. I'm in 2 minds, but I have to run now. I point my torch in the general direction of the sound, and there's branches moving. I start moving away from the area like an SAS trooper. I hear distance movement again. Lots of twigs breaking now, from heavy footprints. I don't see anyone now, but I know I'll shoot them. Silence now. I wait a few minutes and head back for my backpack. It's not hanging over the branch anymore. It's on the ground. That's the scariest part for me. Whatever I've been chasing could have never beaten me back to my bag. So something or someone else moved it. The branch is intact, which doesn't make sense either. At this point, I tabble out onto the main road pretty sharp with no incident. I call my fiancée, who quickly picks me up, and I'm violently sick. I believe it's from fear. I tell her about what happened and she's freaking out. To this day, I still don't know exactly what happened. I do know I was terrified and I've never experienced anything like it before or since. I've had a truly weird encounter before. I lived in Southern California at the time, up in the San Gabriel Mountains, a couple of hours east of LA. I know when people think of Cali, they all seem to think of the beaches, but I assure you, the land here is very diverse. My hometown is super tiny and has a fairly popular ski resort on the western side of town. If you take the only highway out past the ski resort for several miles, there's literally nothing but forest. And a very old gold mine is actually still there, and it's kind of cool. After those things, there's nothing but national forest. And then, one insanely isolated, very old restaurant that still functions, and then back to the forest for a long time. Anyway, just setting the scene. I was about 10 or 11 when this happened. It's almost Christmas. It snowed heavily, and the snow's still falling on the evening of this happening. My stepdad decided that we would cut down our own Christmas tree this year, so we get into my mum's big Dodge truck and headed off to the mine, which is a couple of miles past the ski resort. We got to the base of the road and were talking and laughing, etc. My stepdad was driving pretty slow since it was snowing decently. They had ploughed part of this road recently too, and there were big snow berms on either side of us, down near up to the top of the truck, probably 8 feet off the ground. So it's just barely getting dark now. Not quite dark, but twilight I guess. So not dark enough that we can't see anything, but dark enough that the headlights of the truck are on. Quite suddenly, from over on my side there comes a huge dark shape that arches over the top of the snow berm. It lands in the middle of the road fairly gracefully almost. My stepdad slams on the brakes. I am too stunned to speak or even scream, because there crouching in the middle of the road is some creature. It has a long muzzle and pointy ears, covered in fur. Now, I have really never seen anything like it. This all happens in seconds. The thing jumps down and crouches, glancing at us. My stepdad slams on the brakes, and then it just vaulted up and over the beam and disappeared. It must have been 6 or 7 feet tall. I've never seen anything quite like it. My stepdad refused to talk about it when I asked, terrified. If he had seen the same thing too, I knew he did because how quick he braked, and he was wide-eyed and white for the rest of the journey. I never did bring it up again because we hadn't had the best relationship since then. But sometimes, I wish I could know what actually happened then. It still shakes me to my very core, even to this day. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks, and tons of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. Or there are some of out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places. A lot of the people from where I am are really poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I do a lot of work online. If I didn't have that going for me, I'd have to move somewhere else. It's just one of them small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there for too long. No opportunities or chances for the people that fairly deserve it. And nothing for miles around, like honestly, you're trapped there. I hated it. To the east of my town, there's a massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking on them with my dog, but it can be a bit of an unnerving experience sometimes. It's about a 10-mile drive from town, and there's no cell phone service for miles or houses. In the past, there's been a lot of vehicle break-ins on the trailheads. I mean, literally, the gravel there is littered with bits of broken glass from what I can only assume is break-ins. Sometimes, there's really shifty people hanging around those trailheads or just driving around out on the forest roads. There are really rough roads, and you'll see these beat up $500 cars barreling along them that are meant for a 4x4. Some of the people you see in the cars look like the guy that got crushed by an ATM in Breaking Bad. All that said, it's still a great place to camp. However, you have to be careful. A few years ago, 2 friends of mine and I decided to play paintball in the National Forest. We decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip, so we can play the next morning also. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drive a couple of miles to one of the most popular camping spots. Sadly, a church group or something had taken off all the spots. This really got us annoyed. This was really the only camping spot that we're familiar with, and it's getting late. We decide to keep on looking, so we drive for about an hour further into the woods. By now, it's getting dark, and we're getting worried about finding a spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but no service of course. We turn off onto an unfamiliar road that isn't in very good shape. In fact, it looks like the Forest Service rangers used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. That being said, it looked like a 4x4 had been going over the mound, so it's worn now. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to go over it. Now, there was an old gravel road on the other side, and the road was pretty much clear of debris. We drove for a few miles down the road, coming across an opening next to a creek. There were some blue traps hanging over a plywood nailed to a tree. That's odd. That said, it was pretty much dark now, and we didn't want to keep driving around all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck light running, and we set up in the tent. After we set up, I start noticing there's a lot of trash in the woods. I see a green bottle on the ground. I took a look at the label and see that it's a bottle of some home and garden insecticide. I was really tired now and thought someone was dumping some garbage here. None of us thought it was weird that someone would be dumping garbage here when we're more than an hour away from the nearest home. We set up camp, have some beers and made chili from scratch. By this time, it's probably 11 PM and we're eating. We noticed a faint glow from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles don't make sense. It seemed like it was far too bright and wasn't moving. It's a kind of glow you see over a big bright city, and we don't see the light source itself. Since there were no other access roads in the area, we decided it's not campers. The hill was about a quarter of a mile from our campsite, and we investigate. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have done it. However, we had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, and 2 of us decide to look. My other friend decides to stay. He's gonna do some popcorn on the fire. So we start walking towards the light source, and the situation gets stranger. All the trees in the area have their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. It could have been beavers, but Why would they go all the way around a tree in a perfect circle? We start talking about the ghost in pretty loud voices, probably due to our drunkenness. As we're almost to the top, my friend falls and yells out. A few seconds later, the light goes out. We look at each other and decide that maybe we don't need to see what it is after all. Walking back in silence and keep on looking back every few seconds, we decide to turn off our flashlights and return to the campsite with the moonlight guiding us. We get a couple of 100 feet from the campsite. I can see my other friend Isaac walking around. He's wearing a hooded coat that I've never seen him wear before. For some reason, he has a paintball gun. That seems odd. We look at each other. The fire's dying down. We don't see the campsite well. Now, we've been gone for an hour. From the distance, it appears as though my friend is looking for something. He kept walking around the site and peering in. When we're almost back to the campsite, we see our friend walk up the road we came from. We figure he's went to the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us. When we got back, we sat next to our fire waiting for him to return. All of a sudden, we see him lurch out of the tent and vomits. After we left, he had a few more drinks apparently. We ask him why he's wandering around with the paintball gun, and he gets a strange face and says, "They're locked in the cab of the truck." "Did you unlock it?" "No." We go to the truck and enter the door code and see our paintball equipment just as we left it before. The keys to the truck are hidden underneath a magnetic fob. I get a sinking feeling. What were you doing after we left? I watched a movie then fell asleep. But wait, you were walking around with a paintball gun, right? Did you just change jackets? He said he'd been in the tent the whole time, wearing the same unhooded fleece. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it wasn't him. At this point, of course, we're all too drunk to drive, but we decide to go ahead and pack up and go back to my house for the night. We don't bother packing up the tent, we just fold it with the sleeping bags and think, heck, jumping in the F-150. When we get up to the dirt hump, we see something grey blocking our path. The metal barrier that's been laying in the woods is now erect. By this point, we've all sobered up. No one wants to get out of the car to try and move the barrier. I had a metal guard on the front of my truck, so I slowly tap it. It falls over, and we drive very slowly over it, terrified we're gonna pop one of the tires and be stranded. It didn't. As we drive down the road, we see a vehicle following us with its lights off. It's probably 1,000 feet behind us, but we keep catching glimpses of it on the moonlight, and now begin to drive as quick as I possibly can. The vehicle keeps pace. It doesn't get any closer though. It just stays 1 or 2 turns behind us, but always follows. After 45 minutes of speeding, we get back to the main paved road. I start to drive everyone back to my home and decide to go a different way. I've never experienced anything like it in my life. Rural camping can be very dangerous, and we've never went back there since. Red River Gorge is a beautiful and huge park full of wildlife, rock climbing, waterfalls and dense forests, gorges and beautiful views. The place feels truly isolated, disconnected from the rest of the world. One evening, my boyfriend D and I decide to go camping at the gorge. We went out and tried to find a campground that was as backwards as possible. Sites were spread far from each other. Our site, that was on the edge of a very steep drop-off. We arrived at sunset and quickly set up. By the time we'd fully set up, the sun had set, and we began making a fire. About 20 minutes into relaxing, we began to hear howling that doesn't go away, and it doesn't sound like it's far from us. We both freaked out by the realization that there were wolves nearby, but we tried to not overreact and continued to sit by our fire. 10 minutes later, I start hearing a faint yelling about 15 feet away past the cliff's edge. Now, I told Dee to be quiet and listen, and we're both frozen out of fear. A woman was now screaming. I couldn't make out any words at that point, but it was a deep, gurgling shriek, a noise that I've never heard a person make in my life before. Then I heard it. She was screaming, "Help, please someone help. Someone please help me," repeating this over and over again, howling at the top of her lungs. I'm terrified. She could have been turned around in the dark and fallen off the cliff. She could have been attacked by wolves or a bear or bitten by a snake. At this point we both sprinted into my car, frantically climbing inside, locking the doors. I tried calling the police but have no service. I threw the car in reverse and sped down the dirt road to find anyone that could help. The shrieks continued. I didn't make it far before I found 3 young men standing on the edge of the forest. I slowed down and cracked my window, still hearing that woman begging for help, and asking the men if they heard that. How could they have not heard it? I told them it was a young woman screaming in the forest. Then, 2 of them went sprinting into the darkness. Without questioning me or anything, the other one just stood by my car, assuring me he had no idea what was happening. While the 2 men were somewhere in the forest, I drove further down the dirt road until I found a spot to turn around at. When I came back, the screaming had stopped, and the men were back by the side of the road. I slowed down and asked them where the woman was, and one of the men that had run into the woods said, "Don't worry, it was actually just a kid messing around." I just said okay. I drove back as quickly as possible. We left the campsite and went straight home. Once out of the woods, we called the local police station multiple times to no answer. I know it wasn't a child. I've never heard such primal screams in my life. It made my skin crawl and my heart race just thinking about it. What did those men do that night? What was I a witness to? I live just where farmland meets the edge of the suburbia, on an island off the coast of BC. The climate here is sub-temperate rainforest, so the natural and untouched landscape is incredibly wild, dense and lush. I'm keen on endurance cycling, and I take full advantage of the trail network in the forest surrounding my area. I work long hours, so most of my winter rides are in complete darkness with my trusty trail light. One section of my home trail winds through a rainforest bog full of hundreds of trees. They're huge. It's absolutely beautiful in daytime. It feels like a magical place with shafts of sunlight piercing the fog, hundreds of different species of flora, and there's so many wild animals out there. It's really beautiful. Now at nights, my gut starts tightening as the thought of passing through this mile-long section of trail appears. One day about a year ago, I was lucky enough to get a chance to go for a ride through it, so I took it. It was cold and very rainy, with few other people out on the trail. I had packed thermos of hot coffee in my backpack, and I thought the rainforest-style bog was the best place to take a rest as any. Now, I chill out. I have an interest in botany, so I was looking closely at the lynches growing off of the huge Douglas fir. But suddenly, I felt distinctly not alone. No biggie. Lots of people use a trowel, although not many are out there that day because the weather's so wet and cold. And that's when I heard it. A meow. That's odd because this isn't a good place for a cat to be alone. We have cougars and bears, but I hear a meow again. Except this time, it was canned and robotic sounding, like somebody playing a bad audio file with a cat. My gut starts to clench. It just sounded wrong somehow and I can't figure out why. My hands were shaking when I unzipped my backpack to put my coffee thermo back in. I felt waves of nausea roll over me, and the air suddenly felt dense and thick. I was in a rainforest surrounded by trees and moss, but I felt like I can't get enough oxygen. I hadn't seen anyone for at least 10 miles, and I was distinctly aware of how far I was, and I couldn't really get any cell reception here either. Now, I hear the same meow again, but this time closer. I've never heard a cat like this before. It sounded like an imitation of a cat or a person saying meow. It was so tiny, cold and robotic. I now know that without hesitation, it's time for me to go immediately. I was panicked on the inside, but can't show fear, so I casually slung my leg over my bike and start riding. As soon as I got out of the bog, I ride the rest of the way home like a bat out of hell, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. I can't see anything. I will never forget this experience for as long as I live. I've had some pretty disturbing things happen on my night rides, but nothing ever like this. I hate the fact that clearly something was imitating a cat, and I'm sure it was a recording. God knows who was out that deep into the forest too. I just hope I don't encounter this again. I used to love going for long hikes in the forest near where I live. I usually did it on summer's evenings. Yeah, I know this probably isn't the safest thing to do, but I always had my hunting rifle on me anyway. I mean, I'd be stupid not to. All it takes is one wild animal to go for you, and if you're unarmed, good luck to you. So anyway, I set out one summer's evening. I had my iPod playing some really chill songs and I felt really good about myself. I can't really get cell phone signal where I go because the trees cover it, but I like listening to my music. Now I was a good 40 minutes into my hike. There was enough moonlight for me to see where I was going. That's how I normally planned my hikes, when the moon was out of its brightest on the most clear days, so I can see everything. I'm really enjoying myself this night. I found true tranquility. I decided to stop for a minute, take off my headphones, and just pour out some of the hot chocolate I had in my flask. Now the second I do this, I have the feeling that I'm not alone, and I can't describe this feeling. It's almost like I'm comfortable in my own presence, but I don't want to be joined by anyone else, and this unsettles me. I just think I'm just being a little paranoid. I say to myself, thank God I've got my rifle, and I could have sworn I heard a laugh afterwards. No, it must have been just an animal, surely. So I go about drinking my hot chocolate. As I do so, and I'll never forget this, I hear someone whisper behind me, "Mind if I have some?" And a terrifying laugh follow. Now the next few seconds is a complete blur as I fumble, fall over getting up, grab my rifle, and scream myself, and sprint in the complete opposite direction to where I heard the voice and back onto the trail. I try and scream out that I have a gun, but I can't get the words out. What's worse is I hear rustling behind me. I continue sprinting up the trail, only to slip temporarily again, and now on my back. I lay there wondering whether it's better to pretend I'm still. I look behind me, and I can see what appears to be the butt of a cigarette lit in the distance. Well, looks like I'm going to keep moving then. I get up again, and scream I have a gun and I'm not afraid to use it. What's worse, I'm sure I hear laughter in the distance after saying this. I sprint all the way back to my car. I don't even bother going back for my flask or anything. I immediately get on my radio and call it into the park rangers in the area, who say they're going to check it out and they want me to show them exactly where it is. I say you've got no chance and speed out of there. And the whole drive home, I can't stop thinking, who in their right mind was out there? How long were they stalking me for, and what on earth did they want? They clearly weren't mentally sane, whoever or whatever this was. Now, I don't believe in the paranormal, but this could have easily been something like that, because why would you be out there with no torch or anything? Maybe it is an insane person. All I know is that I never got to the bottom of it, and I never went out on my own in the woods at night again. Now, my father had worked as a ranger for a long time. He said he absolutely loved the job, and he still talks about it today. For a long time he was trying to get me to follow in his footsteps, but I prefer science, so it was never going to be a job for me. He would always share experiences when I was growing up. Never scary ones, just ones that a kid might be interested in. However, he did tell me about one experience that really changed my mind about the job and what he saw. He actually waited until I was much older, I mean literally 1 year ago, to tell me because he was worried how much it might scare me. And to be honest, it's understandable. So my father told me about one particular winter that he was working. He said he actually enjoyed it because he thought the forest looked absolutely beautiful in the winter. He said he always found peace and loved to read in the moonlight. I told him it was bad for his eyes, and he said, yeah, that's probably why I can barely see now, and we both laughed at this. He also said too, because of the snow, it would actually reflect most of the moonlight so you could actually see quite well. He said that often he would be stationed where there were very few residents around. He would have a few call-outs, but not as many as normal. Usually they'd just get called to search for people that gone missing in the snow. Now this was good and bad because you could see footsteps, but they would quickly disappear. And this one particular night was no different. My dad said that he spent the first while just reading like he normally did, and just looking at the trees and appreciating them. He said he loved the way you could see the moonlight casting a shadow, as though you're being watched constantly by the trees as they move with the moonlight. I think myself I would have found this pretty scary, but my dad insisted it was peaceful. He said he was having regular contact with his friends over their radio, which was in the cabin near where he was stationed at. He said he would go inside there and would read even more. Now this story took place about 20 years ago, so there wasn't that many things to do to stay entertained like you have now. Now my dad said while he was reading, he kept hearing a strange owl type sound outside that he couldn't exactly figure out where it was coming from. He said he tried his best to figure it out, but he was sure it was just some animal he hasn't seen before. He decided to step out at one point to try and figure out where the sound was coming from. He still couldn't really see anything, so he thinks it's just his mind playing tricks on him. He doesn't want to read now though. He says this goes on for about another 3 minutes on and off. He says it's really weird. He said it sounds like an owl's directly on top of the cabin, but every single time that he goes outside he can't actually see anything there. Getting agitated, he decides to climb up the side of it with a small ladder. It probably wasn't the best idea because how cold it is and the danger to fall off, but he has to know what this is. He begins climbing up when he realises something's knocked the bottom of the ladder. Strangely, it actually helped support him as he went up, so he thought that was odd but continues on. He looks up and he can't see a thing. No Santa Claus, he said to himself as a joke. Yeah, my dad's still really bad at jokes. It's a little odd he can't see footprints, but maybe the creature's up in some of the trees where he can't see it. He said the strangest thing is that every single time that he goes outside and tries to look for it, it stops. Convinced it's an animal, he decides to go in again. My dad had a few things that were stressing him out in his personal life, and he doesn't really want to bother himself with any other added stresses, especially because he's already on job, and decides to not bother investigating regardless if he hears the sound or not. Fortunately, he didn't have to as he didn't hear it again. My dad has to do a quick patrol in the area, so heads out. He decides to bring his book just in case he has to stop anywhere for a little while. Now my dad says that he felt very peaceful when he stepped out. Nothing was off, and everything was very scenic. He said it looks like you're in a winter wonderland sometimes when you're out in the forest like that. But you have to make sure you keep moving because you will die of the cold if you stay still for too long. With this in mind, my dad sets out on his patrol. He goes through the tree line. Now my dad only sees it for a second, but he's sure he saw a person up ahead of him, quickly darting through the trees. He looks to the side, then back up to where this thing is again and can't see anything. He's pretty sure that it's his mind, just getting carried away with the night, but it does worry him a little bit. Deciding that it's probably nothing and he should investigate, he continues going up ahead where he saw this thing. He continues trudging through the snow with only the crunching of the snow beneath his feet to keep him company. He gets to exactly where this thing is and he can't see anything. He can see a winter fox, which is extremely rare apparently and something he's never seen before. It kind of looks like a normal fox but white. My dad realizes this is extremely strange because they shouldn't be in the area that he's in. He turns around to look for more, but he realizes the creature's gone. My dad stays there for a minute and actually becomes a little worried and decides to head back to the cabin. Now, he's rather concerned that something's a little off. Playing it down to himself, he decides to trace his steps back to his cabin. He's also getting a bit cold now because he stopped so much and he really needs to pick up the pace, so that's what he does. The walk back is uneventful, and again he finds peace as he can see the top of the cabin light through the tree lines. He makes his way over and stops. Something's off again. He's sure that he left the ladder completely up so he could go up the cabin again if he wants to, but now it's laying in its side. Also, what's weird is there seems to be footsteps around it that aren't his own. But there was some fresh snow, so that could have caused it. He decides to put the ladder back where it's supposed to be and head inside. The second he does so, he gets a call out that they have to look for a missing person who's got lost kayaking or camping. My dad thinks great. Just as I think this can't get any worse or more strange, I have to go back out there again. Plus I'm not even that warm. He decides to quickly make a coffee so he can keep himself warm. Not just from drinking it, but from keeping the bottle under his coat so he can use that to keep his body warm. He grabs his biggest coat he has and he heads out now. He has to go in essentially the opposite direction that he come from. He decides he's going to keep a hiking pace and now he's focused on his job. He sets off into a darker area of the forest now, where the tree cover's a lot stronger. Luckily the snow is not as deep here, so my dad can make his way through quite easily. My dad said the whole time he was just thinking of being back home with his wife and family, because as much as he enjoys the job, he admitted that he does have some days where he really doesn't know what to think of the job when he gets scared on his own. Again, something he only revealed a lot later to me. As my dad's walking, he realizes that the snow's got lighter and lighter, to the point that there's virtually none around him on the ground. It's still in the trees, but not much. The forest seems to be getting impossibly dense now. My dad said it actually worried him a bit because it actually become almost like true pitch black darkness at times. But again, he has to keep looking for this person. In this new part of the forest, my dad said that he can't see any signs of life. He's coming up to the edge of where he needs to search, and he's actually angry he can't find somebody. He knows that it's only a matter of hours before somebody could either fall unconscious or die of hypothermia, so he needs to continue the search as quickly as possible. Just as he stops, he realizes that the forest is a little too quiet. He's been calling out for signs of anyone, but no one responds. He's standing there in silence, trying to hear for anything when a loud thud happens next to him. He looks to his left, and a huge tree branch has fell right next to him. He quickly moves away in case any more fall. My dad says this is something that occurs naturally, but he was a little concerned. He decides to quickly hurry up his search now, and picks up the pace again, hiking in a big circle. My dad tries to get onto the radio, but he can't get through to anyone. He realizes that the trees have got so thick, almost impossibly, that he can't get any reception at all. He's actually a little frustrated now and realizes he probably needs to get back, because he doesn't want to be lost out here either. He would have a good idea of what to do, but he never really wanted to put this into practice. This is something else my dad explained to me. Even if you're the most experienced outdoors person, you never really want to be lost out there on your own, because anything could go against you, anything could happen. So he continues on. As he's doing so, he can hear a strange screaming sound coming from what must be miles away, but strangely from all directions. My dad said that he's never heard anything like it. He's actually worried it's a pack of animals hunting him, so he stops dead. Just as he does so, he realizes that the sound seems to stop for a few seconds, then comes even closer. In between the sound stopping, there's some kind of thumping sound on one of the trees further away. My dad calls out, "Hey, I'm a ranger looking for you. Where are you?" Just as he does this, a strong wind picks up, and the thumping sound seems to be coming from all directions. My dad says he's very freaked out now and realizes something's off. He decides to continue the search at the quickest possible pace now, continuing the loop back to where he started. The forest is still far too dense and something's just off. He realizes too that the sound seems to be following him. He knows the sound isn't a human sound, so he knows he's not got to look for the person in this area because they can't possibly be, or he would have found them by now. He tries again to radio this in, but there's no response. Just static. My dad starts to jog now because he knows that if he doesn't move, something bad's gonna happen. He has to stop for a moment to figure out his bearings because he's lost. He has no idea exactly where he is, and he can't see the moon now because of the tree cover. Out of the corner of his eye, he can see a faint red glow. He turns to his left and he can see two red glowing orbs that he realizes are eyes just off in the distance. He said it was probably about 20 feet away, but around it is a completely black tall figure. It was impossibly tall, like 7 feet or so. It's impossible to be a person, and he doesn't know what to do. He's completely frozen there. He's never seen anything like this in his life. He says he can see some yellowish colours too, as he realises whatever this thing is baring its teeth at my dad. He doesn't need a second longer. He drops his flashlight and begins sprinting in the opposite direction. My dad says that in all of his years of doing this job, he's never seen anything like this before. He doesn't know where he's running to, and he can hear this thing just slightly behind him. Not chasing him, but hitting trees. What is this thing? He thinks to himself. My dad then sprints as fast as he possibly can until he has to stop again to catch his breath. He's glad that this thing isn't near him, and he stops again as he realizes that he's come into the normal part of the forest. He starts walking now, convincing himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him when he hears that awful sound again. The knocking on the tree, but closer this time. He looks to his left and he can see two glowing eyes, met by another pair, then another, then another. My dad said it's impossible to tell because how scared he was, but there must have been at least 6 or 7 of these things. He rubs his eyes and screams what the hell is happening, and sprints back to the area that he knows. He runs as quick as he can, and he can't actually hear the thumping now because his heart's beating so loud in his ears. He turns one last time as he realizes he's found the cabin. He can just about see the light just in front of him. He jogs over there, but he can't stop but look behind himself one more time. As he turns, he realizes just at the start of the dense tree line, all of the eyes are still watching him, until they all go to black. My dad continues until eventually he gets back into the cabin, quickly slamming the door behind him. He gets onto the radio and starts explaining what he saw, but stops and says, "Sorry, what I meant to say is I've had a look and I can't find the person. They say no worries, we've just found him about an hour ago." My dad then looks at the clock and realizes that he's been out there for at least 4 hours. He says it's impossible because he was convinced that he was only out there searching for at least 30 minutes. But the time can't possibly be wrong. My dad said that he didn't get a wink of sleep that night. He still felt as though he had adrenaline in the morning and felt absolutely drained. Apparently when he come home, my mum said what was wrong with him and he looked as though he'd seen a ghost, but he refused to tell her what happened. He still did to this day. My dad doesn't know what to think of the experience, and he actually moved us to another state after that. He never explained why to the family, only recently to me, and I don't know what to make of the experience. I know there's things out there that we don't understand. My dad was such an experienced ranger too, and everything else that happened in his career was so normal, but this one thing, it gives him and me nightmares to this day. I asked my dad what he thought it was, and he said he doesn't know. It was just some kind of forest creature that was letting him know that he was in their territory and he should never have been. My dad doesn't understand too how the forest was so silent. There's always something you can hear, but everything didn't make sense in that moment. He's never found that part of the forest too where there was no snow on the ground and the trees were so dense. He's still not sure what to make of it. He doesn't like to think of it, and there's some dense parts of the forest that he'll never go to this day. Even though we're in a different state, he's that scared of it. A few weeks back, I posted on a thread about rural hauntings, cryptid encounters and folklore. I figured this would be a great time to share my experience. So we're from a small town in southern Ohio, about an hour east of Cincinnati. This town has been plagued with people dying young, and in some pretty gruesome ways. There's a lot if you just do a Google search. There is a section of woods that seems to have concentrated activity throughout. The woods in question are surrounded by 2 churches, a hospital, and an area of housing. Now, as full disclosure, things do not happen every time we go in, but when they happen, things go off the charts. The most common thing that we've experienced is that we're dubbed the geeks. We call these geeks because they are tall, sometimes 12 feet, and gangly and move awkwardly. And they move between trees swiftly. They never present themselves outwardly, only glimpses of them as they move through the trees. The scariest thing about them, however, is the sound they make, like a deep groan, just before they start moving. Now there's one other creature too, Hydra. Only one of us has ever seen this thing, and so far, there's only ever been one witnessed. It's a small primate-like creature with a face like a hideous woman, a chimpanzee body, long greasy black hair, and boils on its back, which are red. The member of our group that's encountered this thing refuses to tell us how it went. I had to go down to visit my friend at his college in Virginia, US. We had hung out on campus until like 3 AM and decided to go for a walk. We walked through along a path and wound up in some woods. My friend insisted that this was a shortcut back to campus. We entered the woods and walked for about a mile, only with our phone flashlights on. Just as we ceased at the hill, we see something. Originally, I thought it was a white owl sitting on a brand of a rotten wooden tree trunk. However, as we walk, my curiosity turns to horror as I discover this isn't an owl. About 20 yards away from us, a white face peeked around the tree. Its face looked as though it's made out of old bone, slightly yellow and cracked. Its shape was a mix of a human's and an elk's, or horse's. Its eyes were sunken into the back of its head. It really appears like they're made out of charcoal. Now, I've never seen anything like this. It had no mouth, no nose, and I stopped and tried to get a better look, but that's when it appeared just over the tree to be glaring at me. Its long arm pulled around as though it's trying to get a better look at us. Its fingers were long and thin like spider legs. It tilts its head and looks over to the other tree. I grab my friend's arm and we run. I've been searching for weeks to try and figure out what I saw, and the only thing I compare it to accurately is a Wendigo. Now this isn't my story but happened to my uncle. We live in Utah, and my uncle Mark went on a mission at 19. They sent him to an Indian reservation in Arizona. They paired him up with a companion called Carl. When they first got there, there was a huge rift with the locals on the reservation with them being there. They didn't want my uncle and Carl staying on the reservation grounds. Eventually they come to a compromisation that they would stay on the outskirts in a trailer. The reservation wasn't big, and was located next to a heavily wooded area. The first night they were trying to sleep, when suddenly their trailer started to shake violently back and forth. Startled, and not sure what was happening, they climb under their table for cover. Mark could distinctively hear someone pushing in on both sides of the trailer like a group of people. After about 5 minutes it stops. The next day, they made rounds on the reservation and were talking to the locals. Carl made a comment to one of the families that their trailer was shaking the night before. The family got very quiet and told them they had to leave. They think it's strange but don't think much of it. The next night it happened again. They woke up to their trailer shaking back and forth. Again, they climbed under the table until it stopped. This went on for 2 more nights. Anytime they tried to talk to anyone about it, they got quiet and told them to leave. Mark started thinking that due to the tension of their arrival, the locals were trying to scare them off. They then go into a convenience store and they're talking and saying how frustrated they are with the situation, and the clerk overheard and said, "They can't talk about it, it's forbidden." The guy continues to tell them about skinwalkers. He said they're evil demons that were once Native American witches. If they talk about it, the skinwalkers will come for their souls. They just walked out baffled, thinking it was a scare tactic. So that night, when the shaking starts again, my uncle decided to be brave and confront them. He went to the trailer door, flew it open and yelled, "Hey!" When he did that, he saw 3 animals run off. 2's a wolf and 1's a bear, looking strange, almost like they have human features. As he watches them run towards the trees, All three stood up on two legs and started slowly going towards the tree line, making a human cackling sound. It scared him so bad that they called their mission president the next morning asking to be relocated, and they were that day. For a year nothing happened. One day, they announced that Carl was being located to another city and Mark was getting a new companion, Jimmy. They had to drive for about an hour to pick Jimmy up from the airport. The road they travelled through went through the boundaries of the reservation. They arrived at about 8 PM and met Jimmy and they had to go and leave. The mission president tells Jimmy, "We are driving through a dangerous area at night, so we can't make any stops. If you need to use the restroom, you need to go now." Jimmy says, "I'm fine." The mission president gets serious, even though that Mark's a bit freaked out. "I'm not kidding. Go do your business." Jimmy insisting he was fine, so they hit the road. As they were about 30 minutes into the drive, they were going through the area of the reservation boundaries when Jimmy starts complaining that he needs to pee badly. The mission president says, "We can't stop here. You have to hold it." But he can't, so they have to stop and says, "Please be quick and near the car. You better be fast. Get into the car quick afterwards." With a confused look, Jimmy says, "Alright," opens the door and starts. About 5 seconds later, the president says nothing and just yanks Jimmy into the car and floors it. Jimmy's freaking out, saying, "What's going on?" The mission president says nothing and increases the speed. All of a sudden, Mark sees something next to the car. There's a giant wolf-type creature next to the car on 2 feet. Mark looked at the speedometer and they're going nearly 60. The creature kept up with the car until finally it goes into the trees. Jimmy, shaking, says, "What did I just see?" The president says, "Next time I tell you to take care of your business, you do that." I wanted to start off by saying that I'm a 27-year-old and I've never experienced anything like this in my life, and I hope to never experience it again. This happened 3 days ago. It was about 11:30 at night and I was taking my dog out to go to the bathroom. My boyfriend and I live on about 4 acres of land. We have overgrown fields in the distance. It's somewhat near the house but not super close. I was carrying one of those spotlight flashlights. It's so powerful that you can see the beam through the night sky. Now my dog and I were getting so close to the field, so I decided to scan it with the flashlight, and what I saw next terrified me. I saw this creature walking through the field. It had a human-shaped head, but the eyes were nothing like I've ever seen before. They were so big that it appeared to take up most of its face. They glowed in a way that I've never seen before, like a piercing glow. I know that flashlights can create a certain type of reflective glow, but this is different, almost like lights coming from its eyes. Now, I had actually lived in a woodland area, so I came into contact with many animals at night. This was not like any animal I've ever seen before. It's weird because I don't recall seeing a mouth, but I was so fixated on its abnormally large eyes that I probably didn't pay attention to the lower parts of its face. Its eyes were shocked and evil looking. The expression really stood out as being so eerie to me. Now, let's get to the body. It was somewhat human shaped but had an abnormally long extremities. Even though the overgrown field covered most of its body, I can tell the shape of it. Its arms are way too long for its body. I checked out how tall the overgrown grass was the next day and estimated it's 6 feet tall. The way it walks terrifies me, and walking sideways while staring at me really scared me. I have to admit that I got really scared when I lowered the flashlight to the ground, but then I got enough nerve to raise it. It had made its way down the field a little more, but it was still walking sideways and staring at me. Needless to say, I took my dog inside after that and had a mini freak out. I've done a lot of searching online and still can't figure out what this thing was. When I was 15, My father and I love to go camping. This is something we did whenever we had the opportunity. There was some really good forest around where we lived, full of life and sounds. Probably the most peaceful part for my dad at least was the sounds of the nature. It annoyed me, but my father loved it. It made a difference from the mechanical sounds of the job where he worked. So on one particular evening, we do some fishing. We're having a great time looking up at all the stars. The sun's just beginning to set, and you can just about see the northern star in the hemisphere. We decide to call it a night. Now while we're walking back to our camping site, my dad continually stops, not saying why. Now normally I just make fun of him, but I can see that he has his hand on his gun. I know something is wrong. I don't want to scare my dad and act as though I don't notice anything. Every time that we begin walking, we can hear a sound, louder than our own footsteps, that can't be identified as one specific thing. It's hard to describe, but almost like a deep thud, just beyond your range of hearing, but you can still notice it, if that makes sense. So anyway, we continue towards our camp when my dad suddenly shouts out, "Hey, you stop immediately, I have a gun." I ask my dad what's going on. He tells me to be quiet. He says you take one more step and this is your last warning. And with that, gunfire. There's a few moments of silence before my dad grabs my hand and tells me to run. I don't know what's going on and begin crying in fear. What's more strange is we run past our campsite. We run all the way back to where our car is and speed out of there. He tells me to never tell my mum what happened and that he'll explain one day. Now as you can imagine, this is the most terrifying experience in my life. Eventually my dad did tell me. He said he thought we were being followed by a very large man, but he eventually caught a glimpse of something in the moonlight. Now it looks like a person, yes, but upon closer inspection, he can tell that it's definitely not a normal person. He describes it to me as a skinwalker. Now I don't know too much about them, just that they're to be avoided. He said that's when he pulled the trigger. He knows he landed a direct hit on it, or at least within an inch of this creature, and it didn't even move an inch. This is when he made us begin running. So this happened 17 years ago, so please forgive me if the exact details are fuzzy. So it's the summer of 1999. I was spending the vacation with my mother in New Mexico. I was a 12-year-old at the time and had a severe attitude. I made friends easily with a few girls that lived just around the corner from my mum's home. We spent every moment together that summer. We're a group of 4, all of us thinking we were older and smarter than everyone. Nikki, Katie, Julie, and myself were the last generation of home phone lines, playing outside on the trampoline until dark and sleepovers. We would watch VHS tapes, listen to cassette tapes on our Walkman. It was okay to let your children walk around town at night, and we very rarely locked our front door. We had no cell phones or internet. My backyard had a concrete wall around it and a gate. Now behind the wall was desert as far as the eye could see. Just a barren wasteland of dirt, cacti, shrubs and mountains way off in the distance. This town had a major railroad track running straight through it. There was a major street that had a gas station, restaurant, and hotels and attractions. We all received the same warnings from our parents. Stay out the desert, stay away from the tracks, and don't walk the main strip at night. Do you think we listened though? Absolutely not. Julie, Nikki, and I spent our days walking through the desert, crossing the tracks down the strip to Katie's home. Sometimes we would just walk around till dusk. Some days, we would go to my home to jump on the trampoline. This particular day, we get to Katie's house prepared to stay the weekend because her parents are out of town. We were gonna have a party. The first few nights, the girls would jump in from a spiral staircase to a giant beanbag. I refused to participate in this, due to my extreme fear of heights. When we got down to the sleepover business, so to say, and decided to watch the original Exorcist, you know, the one with Linda Blair, I didn't sleep. The second night, we all told our parents that Katie's mum was going to drive us to the movies. We all got money from the movies, then promptly walked down to the strip to get junk food. Now, I wish I could say that we're aware of the surroundings, but we're not. We were absolutely oblivious of the man who followed us all the way back to the home. I feel that I should mention that Katie's parents are loaded. They have a huge property with numerous buildings, broken down cars, that her dad was remodeling. Their house had a large open kitchen and dining and living room. There were no walls and the whole room was lined with windows. There were 2 doors front and back. The day was just as planned. We get our junk food and make it home safely. We made pizza in the oven, and for some reason, one of the girls turns on the news. As we're eating, we hear a story about staying inside because there's a report of a suspicious man walking on the strip. That's it, suspicious man. We laugh and joke about it. Fast forward a couple of hours. I don't remember what happened, but as girls do, someone said something that hurt Julie's feelings and she storms out of the home. I went after her, opened the front door just in time to see her lighting a cigarette. I sat there with her on a bench while she gone on about the other 2. Suddenly, the air grows thick with anxiety. Julie felt it too. I quietly ask her if she feels as though she's being watched. She responds with a little nod, and then we're blinded. Someone's in a car in the driveway. My heart's racing as I stood up, pulling Julie out of the spot she seems to be stuck in. As we turned to run inside, the man made a sound. I can't describe this sound other than a high-pitched squeal that turned into a growl. I was scared beyond all reason, but somehow I'm able to get myself and Julie inside. The moment we're inside, the headlights go off. It's pitch black again. I lock the door and turn off the light. By now, Julie has regained her composure to tell the other 2 what's happened. As I frantically check the back door and turn every light off, I tell them to be quiet and listen by the back door. I heard the car door close. I was praying to every god that he would go away. Then, right by my cheek, the door handle started to turn slowly, now frantically. I crawl away from the door. I now move over to where my friends are. For the next 2 or 3 hours, we sat still, listening to this man bang on every window or door trying to get inside. The phone was located across the room right next to the 2 windows. I finally got up. gathering the courage to run to the phone. I call my mum. I tell her that we're all alone and someone's trying to breach the house. I hung up with her and waited. Julie screamed to the man that we called the cops, and all of a sudden, the banging stops. We sat there listening to him getting in his car. Then, the sound starts again, that turned into a growl. He's gone now. My mum and stepdad then show up, checking out the place. They found tyre tracks and cigarette butts in the driveway. Whoever this was had been watching us for a while. The truly scary part is all the scratch marks on the windows and doors. Clearly not possible for a human to make. This is why I know it was a skinwalker. Needless to say, Katie spent the rest of the weekend at Nikki's house and had a great story for her parents, which of course they didn't believe. Even to this day, I'm certain this was something supernatural and not a normal person. I just hope they never come back to me. My family loves to go on vacation in Sweden, and my grandmother even has a cottage in the forest that all the family members use if they want. A couple of years ago when I was 20, I was on vacation there with my mum and grandma sometime in autumn for about 10 days. This is a Swedish backwoods. We go there to unwind, to enjoy nature and take a rest from civilization. Hiking, canoeing, and looking for stuff, sitting around the campfire, and just them sorts of things. It's not completely isolated. You can find some villages and fields here and there. It's definitely very rural though, so you don't have much of a chance of encountering other people. Now, I've always liked to go exploring on my own, finding out the new paths through the woods, fixing our old maps to reflect the landscape better. The maps you can buy of this area haven't been updated for years, and many paths don't even exist anymore due to overgrowth. What I also like to do is explore old abandoned buildings, and rural Sweden's great for this. Back in the 1800s, Swedish people in the countryside were dirt poor and starving, so many moved to the New World for a better life. You can still find the foundations of farmhouses, even foundations of entire villages in the woods, sometimes with rusted 100-plus-year-old farm equipment. Also, like so many countries, Sweden has an issue with rural exodus nowadays, with middle-aged and young people moving away to cities. Old people stay out there until they die, and no one buys their houses until they're literally just sitting there abandoned. This means a lot, so you can find many empty houses in the forest, and I just love exploring them. Most of them have already been looted, presumably by hunters, loggers or hikers, but sometimes you can find interesting things. Now, one crisp autumn day, I took one of our bicycles, a map, and something to eat and drink. Told my mum and grandma I wanted to be back by nightfall, and at the latest, would be set out to explore there. On the map I had chosen, there's a wide loop that I guess would take about 3 hours if the paths were clear, and didn't stop to explore. But even if I did, I guess I had plenty of time until dusk. I had a lot of fun at first, driving the mountain bike down smaller and smaller forest paths, finding foundations of old buildings, and some root cellars that were still intact, and some mushrooms. I have some problems with the map though. Like I said, many paths that are still on the map don't exist anymore, so I had to turn back a few times. But Mostly I had a pretty good idea of where I was. Of course, that made it all take longer than I anticipated, and when I reached the furthest point of the loop, and turned into a path that, according to the map, would take me back and add an hour, the sun's already setting now. At this point, I'm already feeling a bit uneasy. I have to admit, because of my bad time management, and because I was worried that I could trust the map even less than I thought. And shortly before turning onto the path, I found some traps in the woods that kinda creeped me out. 3 big cages, each with a platform in the middle that was connected to a steel door in front. On those platforms were some kind of animal remains, rotted black things with bones sticking out, etc. But it hadn't been touched, I guess, since the doors were still open. I had taken a stick and deactivated the traps by pushing onto the platform through the cage bars. When the doors had snapped shut, it was so loud that I flinched. Now, as clumsily as I was cycling along on the uneven ground, I realised the sun's setting. I had this uncomfortable feeling that everything around me was sort of aware, if that makes sense. It wasn't the feeling of being watched, not quite yet. It just felt like I had to try and be quiet now, somehow. After a while, I came upon a crossroad in a more open area where I was supposed to follow the path straight. The trees were not so high here, and I guessed it had just been one of the clearings created by a severe storm years ago. At that crossroad was a tiny wooden building, somewhere between a shed and a cabin. I had originally set out to find abandoned houses so far, and I've only seen a couple of foundations. So even though at this point I should have turned back, curiosity gets the better of me. I want to check if this was locked and if I could take a peek inside. It's not locked, but the door was kind of stuck in the frame for a moment until I could tear it loose. Inside the cabin was a cot, a tiny oven, a mass of taxidermy animals that I've never seen before. They've even taxidermy animals on the cot and on the oven, now to the walls and ceiling, and the entire inside of the cabin, every inch of it's covered in a layer of black mold. It was so much that some of the animals were there and you couldn't really tell what they were anymore, only guess from the shape. They all looked monstrous covered in that stuff, and the smell was overwhelming. I quickly tried to close the door again, but the wood had warped so much it's not possible, so I left it hanging to get out of there. As I was cycling away from the cabin, I felt so strange. This time, I did feel like I was being watched, and was nonsensically thinking, you should have closed that door. I don't know why I thought that, but it made me uneasy to think the shed door's open. I told myself I'm being silly, because why would it matter? Obviously no one's using it anymore. And about 10 minutes later, the path entered a stretch of older woods with much higher trees. The sun was now close to the horizon, the sky's full of orange light. Under the fir trees, it was already getting very dark. I checked my phone to tell my mum that I'm maybe gonna be late, but there's no reception. A couple more minutes into the dark forest and the path disappeared. At this point, I have 2 options. Try and push through with my bike until I met a logging road that was hopefully on the other side of that stretch of woods and it can take me back. Or return. Go past the mold shed again and try go back the other way. Basically, the second option was not an option for me. As I already said, I kind of had to zigzag and improvise even to come this far, because the map's wrong in every place seemingly. Going all the way back is a perfect way to get lost out there in the dark. But also, I really don't want to go past the shed again. And now I have a sudden aversion to look behind me. As dusk was creeping through the forest, I was getting really paranoid at this point. The uneasy feeling crystallized into the idea that I've disturbed something there. Because I've left the door open, it's following me. I know it's stupid, but I can't shake the feeling. Going back past the shed, past those traps, and then through the ruins of that old village, past the open mouths of the root cellars in the dark. Getting lost in there with the feeling of something possibly on my trail. No way I'm going back. You might even get lost trying to go through the woods in front of me. And I would have to push, maybe even carry my bike. For the woods don't seem to stretch too far in front of me, only left and right, so it seemed like the better option. I was just hoping at this point the supposed logging road on the other side's still there. After tearing through some barbels for a bit, I found what I guess might be the remnants of the old path, because the ground was sort of lower there, and I tried to follow that until I come upon another set of ruins. The foundations of some farmhouse presumably. Behind that, the ground slopes down into a marshy area, with birches that seem very white in the gloom under the trees. At this point, I stopped to listen. I still don't want to turn around. I couldn't hear anything, but the feeling of being watched, being alone, only increases at this point, and I felt like something was coming for me. But like the forest itself was somehow aware of my presence, listening, watching, like it was being deliberately quiet. I was feeling so scared that I didn't even try and talk myself out of the feeling anymore. I just accept it as what I'm dealing with now. I had some leftover food in my backpack, half a sandwich and some sesame snacks. And then, the mushrooms I found earlier. I took it all out, laying it on a stone, on one of the walls that surrounds the ruins. I then said something along the lines of, "Please let me go, I'm really sorry. I won't come back here again. I just want to go home, please. I'm sorry." Or something along the lines of that. And after that, I grabbed my bike and went down into the swamp, still looking back only partially. Luckily, it turned out it wasn't a large swamp or anything. Really just a wet patch for about 200 meters until the ground sloped downwards again, then upwards. Still, it took a while because of the bike to get out of and really hurt my calves. And I can't really see anymore and was constantly stepping into puddles getting stuck. When I emerged on the other side, I was absolutely soaked in sweat. And my heart is absolutely pounding. And then, wouldn't you know it, the trees opened up, and there it is, the logging road. I could have cried with joy and relief in that moment. I stepped onto the road and turned to look behind me, but I can't even see the swamp through the trees now. It's almost pitch black there, but luckily there's some moonlight, and the light on the bike also worked. I climb on my bike, pedaling home as quick as I can. About half an hour later, I even had some cell phone reception for a moment, so I can call my mum and tell her what happened. Well, I told her I got lost. I didn't want her to know that I worked myself into a panic and got into a dangerous situation, that I had a horrible feeling I couldn't shake of being followed. By the time I arrive to our own cabin, I'm completely exhausted and overwhelmed by what's just happened. It's honestly almost putting me into a state of shock thinking of it. I have no idea what was out there, following me or watching me. I don't know why there were so many taxidermy animals in there and it was full of moss and mould. I can't believe something was out there stalking me in the darkness for God knows how long. I've never had a feeling like it in my entire time out in the wilderness since, or before then. It still gives me nightmares to this day. I was 12 or so at the time. Some friends of mine are in the Girl Scouts and invite me to join them for a sleepover at this old sanitarium in Maine, just north of San Francisco. At this time, 50 years ago now, the building's not in the best of conditions. There was an old caretaker's cabin and some outbuildings. My friend and I have wandered around and explored for the first day, Saturday, and well, we're not the best behaved little monsters. In spite of the locked door, we crawl through a window into the caretaker's cabin exploring there. My friend went upstairs and I stay in the downstairs part as a sentry. Already nervous, I was even more jumpy when I heard someone coming down the stairs, but it wasn't my friend. There was no one there, at least I can see. Now fast forward to one evening, in an attempt to go to sleep, we're overtaken by giggles. Now one of the counsellors separated us so the others can sleep. I was placed in bed in this little sunroom thing. It was an enclosed room, but with windows on 3 walls. Now the wall I'm facing actually has a set of French doors and a balcony. Now I'm awoken by a strange sound. It's about 3 in the morning, and everyone else is asleep. I then watch a woman in an old-fashioned dress walk past the doors through to the balcony, look at me, then descend the stairs silently. I figure out it's just a counsellor, until I wake up in the morning and realise that there's no stairs. We explored every acre of that place and never found any signs of where she could have went. And none of the counsellors were up at that time either. Now I'm not one to believe in the paranormal, but I had one experience I simply cannot explain in any other way. So my family owns this old cabin out in the wilderness. It's half derelict, and to be honest, I don't even stay in there because I hate the spiders that I know are above me. I instead sleep outside in my tent. And one night, I'm doing exactly that, thinking, wow, I'm glad I'm in here, not in there with all them spiders and the real danger. At that very moment, I can hear a piano in the background. I think my phone's on, so I go and check it, but it's on charge and there's no sound coming from it. I unzip the tent, and I can see a torch and a white piano. I've rubbed my eyes because this makes literally no sense to me, and this is where the sound's coming from. I pull out my binoculars and sure enough, there's a piano with a torch next to it, and sound coming from it. Hell nah, I think to myself. I look around for people and see no one. I go inside the tent again, going to get my rifle because I'm very scared now. Just as I come into the tent, the sound stops. I come out of the tent and it's gone. Only the torch remains, so it's been knocked over. My dog is absolutely terrified at this point too, so I know something's up. I grab my stuff near my tent and just get the hell out of there with my dog. I've never been back there since, and I still have no logical explanation for this whatsoever. I really wish I had a reasonable answer, but I have none, and I've never seen anything like it. Me and my dad, and younger brothers and mum were all staying in this lovely cabin out in the forest one winter. It was close to Christmas time, and we love staying out there. We're a wilderness family, and my dad's big on hunting, so this was a great time for us, and I have a lot of my most fond memories here. Now one night we're staying in the cabin, and my mum just can't sleep. My dad says she's just being paranoid and that she could go back to bed, but she refuses to. Just as I wake up, and my brother does to hear this, we hear an extremely high-pitched sound that we've never heard before, and literally, all of the windows simultaneously blow out on the cabin. My mum and dad don't take a second to react, rush us into the car. My dad gets his shotgun and does a quick sweep around. He can't find anything. I never seen him look so scared, and hops back into the car, and we drive out of there. A few years later we get the windows replaced, but we end up selling the place. When I speak to my mum and dad about it to this day, they still get very scared and say they really don't have an answer for what happened. When I was younger, I used to love go exploring the woods and forest with my friend. Now, we used to have to lie about what we were actually doing, because there's no way in hell that any parents in their right minds are gonna let their kids do this. But we were lying and did so anyway. Now we set off like normal one day, and it began to rain heavily. I already slipped on a rock and ended up twisting my ankle, so I wanted to go home. However, my friend, James, wanted to stay out later. I was hesitant but said fine because I had nothing better to get on with. So we're going about exploring when we realise how dark it's getting. Not to worry, we have flashlights. We shine our lights around and hit a dark object. We both focus our lights simultaneously and hey, it's a cabin. It's a really old looking one too. We both look at each other and smile, really excited to go and explore in there. My friend James says as a joke, last one to get there is a loser, and jogs off, and what happens no less than 4 seconds later? Twist his ankle like me. He's in some pain, but I literally cannot stop laughing. I still think it's one of the funniest things that I've ever seen. I eventually catch up with him and say we've really got to get heading home now, but not before we explore in here. As we're doing so, I get this horrible feeling like we're being watched. Something just feels off and I don't know what it is. I get worried maybe an animal's in there, so decide to throw a log in. As I do so, I hear an extremely loud thump sound and snap. It scares the life out of me and I actually fall over. I can't believe you're that scared, man, my friend says to me, and I say sharp. I didn't think the floor was that weak. I threw it through the window, but it also props the door open. And as it does so, to my horror, I can see this place has been booby wrapped with a bear trap, and I've just set it off, and some other trap in the background that I can't actually see. And the feeling of being watched? It's getting worse now. We both look at each other terrified, knowing that We can't even run if we want to. We both link arms and kind of support each other's hurt legs and get out of there as quick as we possibly can. We both swore never to tell our parents what happened, but looking back on it now, it's absolutely horrifying to think that someone booby-trapped a cabin in the middle of the woods, obviously trying to lure people in. And that was almost us. If it wasn't for some stupid injuries, my friend would have sprinted in there and trapped himself, and God knows what would have happened. Or it could have been myself. Now, I'd been a search and rescue worker for a few years, so I'd really seen my fair share of crazy things happening, a lot of which will stay with me forever, whether I want it to or not. But there's one thing that stayed with me for completely different reasons. So on one particular call out about 20 years ago, I'd been called to an area that I knew very well and I had no issue actually going into. Apparently somebody in a coat had gone missing who was apparently hiking and hasn't been seen since. I get out there as quick as possible and start my search radius in the area that I've been permitted to search. Now, it wasn't actually nighttime, so I was glad about this. It was about midday, so I was really happy to be out there, because I knew that I had the best chance of finding somebody in the daylight. The chances of finding somebody at night are a lot worse because A, they normally don't have any way of communicating with you outside their own voice. Usually if they had anything with them like a flashlight, it's usually dead by now, and most people don't really know how to make fires. And secondly, you can see everything. So I start my search and I'm just eager to find this person. I don't have any luck for the first hour or two. I eventually make my way up to a big waypoint where I can see quite far in all directions. I decide I need to stop for a minute and drink some water because I don't want to get lost out here myself and get too disorientated. As I do so, another hiker comes up to me. He says, "Hey buddy, are you lost?" I say no, quite the opposite, and laugh. Now he's wearing a green coat, so I know it's not the person that we're looking for. And plus this person looks really young, like he's in his early 20s. The person we're looking for is in his late 40s. I say what's he doing and he doesn't tell me too much. He just says that he loves to hike and explore the outdoors and that he's really having a good time. I explain what I'm doing and he says, "Can I help?" I say sure, and we both sit down together. Now we don't really talk too much because we're really focused on the mission, but I'm actually having a really good time. And it seems like this person is really friendly, and you know what they say, 2 sets of eyes are always better than 1, so I'm sure we're gonna find this person quick. So we search for about a good hour and can't find much, but my new friend, whose name I haven't caught yet, continues saying that we should check in this area. I don't know why, but I decide to follow what he says, and we continue up ahead. He says, "Just follow this all the way down and you'll find them." I'm convinced. I say sure, let's go, and he says, "Sorry, I have to turn back now, good luck." And with that, he disappears down the hill. I'm on job so I can't stop and talk anymore, so I continue going forwards. I realise that I still haven't caught his name, so I quickly run up the hill, and he's nowhere to be found. It's crazy, it's literally like he's vanished, but that shouldn't be possible because I can see everywhere from up here. I think this is really odd, but don't really have time to dwell on it and have to continue. I only have about 2 more hours of daylight too, so I don't really want to be lost out here on my own. So I continue on with my search. Now, I didn't think about that person again because I was too focused on my job. I just thought it was cool somebody came there to help me. Now I stopped again to drink some more water and look up ahead of me, and I can just make out a blue colour coat that matches the description perfectly. I almost spit the water out as I quickly jolt up, literally spilling all of my remaining water on the floor, quickly going over to the area. I call out and blow my whistle, but they don't move. I get a horrible feeling in my body. Just as I head over there, I can hear somebody else calling out to me. It makes me jump for a second, but then I realise it's my name. It's one of the other rescue guys. They've got to him first. He said hey, and my name. We've just found him, and unfortunately he's passed away. I then ask him to describe him to me, and it's literally perfectly to the description of who we're searching for. But suddenly something clicks in my head. The very person that's just been described to me matches identically to the one I'd met earlier, just he looked far younger. I then ask for some more information about the person they've discovered, and ask where specifically that they're from. He then tells me that he's from Quebec in Canada, and suddenly, my heart drops. The person I was talking to had a French-Canadian accent, and then I realised something. I'm not a big believer in the paranormal, but I don't have an exact reason for what happened that day being anything else. When I saw an ID match on the person they discovered, it was striking how similar it was to the person that spoke to me. I believe that that person had come back in spirit form to guide me to their body. It would literally have been impossible for anybody to be out there without being discovered by the search and rescue team, and to be able to disappear like they did. I could have just thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the fact that they appeared so suddenly and disappeared while guiding me to the exact place where the body was is absolutely crazy to me. It's one experience I've never been able to forget since. My dad had been a fire watchman for a long time, and it was never really a job that interested me too much, but some of the things he told me give me nightmares even to this day. I always told my dad a lot of it was probably his mind playing tricks on him, but he's also said other things that made me think otherwise. I want to share a few of them with you today. Now, my father said that it was during one summer that they got an unusual call out. Apparently, somebody had spotted some smoke in one area that was within my dad's region that he had to cover. He had a look in the binoculars but couldn't actually see anything, so decided to go and investigate in the general area. As my dad heads down there, he has a strange feeling that he can't shake, almost like there's some kind of impending doom. He doesn't know what it is. Just as he takes a step forward to go to the area he needs, he hears a strange howling sound. He looks over to his left, and there's a wild dog staring at him. He said it scared the life out of him until we yelled at it and it ran off. My dad said the tension was cut like a knife had gone through it, and he was completely fine now. He continues with no sign of fire, until eventually he finds a small, smouldering area. He thinks this is a little odd because it's almost like somebody's done this on purpose. There's just a single stick on fire. He's never seen anything like this before. And guess what? The feeling that he's being watched comes across again. He thinks this is weird and he picks up the stick, and there's nothing weird about it, just he knows somebody's probably out here because it recently was on fire. He pushes it into the ground and can't seem to put it out. As he's doing that, he hears somebody throw a stone right next to him. He shouts out, "Hey, whoever's doing this, you better stop." Just as he's doing this, he stops midway through his sentence and realizes there's a note attached to the rock. Confusingly, he goes over to it and opens it up. He says the next 3 letters terrified him, and he still has nightmares about it to this day. It just said run. My dad looked up, and somebody has set fire to next to where his vehicle is, and almost entirely around him. Needless to say, my dad didn't need any further instructions. He drops the rock and the note and immediately starts sprinting towards his truck. He manages to get in just before the fire spreads to it and speeds off to the next station. He radios in what's happened, and some of the other guys say they've had some strange reports about a group of people in the woods. My dad finally makes it to safety, and after a while they manage to put the fire out with some of the fire services and other departments. My dad files a police report of what's happened, and a few of the other watch guys file their reports of the strange men they saw. Nobody's sure exactly what happened to this day, and I thank God that my father made it out of there safely. I mean, heck, if he didn't, you wouldn't be hearing this story now. But it absolutely terrifies me to my core, thinking that not only could I have not existed, but some absolute lunatics are out there in the woods doing God knows what, trying to kill an innocent man for no reason. My dad said after that he had a long time off work and got stationed to a complete different area. He actually moved states after that, it scared him so much, but more on that another day. Now my father would also tell me about some beautiful things that they would see in the night sky. Of course there wasn't too much light where my dad was, so in the tower you could get a beautiful view of the stars usually. He said he always liked to see different galaxies and nebulas through his binoculars, and planets sometimes. He said it would only be a star, but he knew exactly what it was because he was always into astronomy, and when he was younger his father had a telescope that he loved to use. And of course, from my dad's generation, they had the whole space race and moon landing, and my dad can just about remember Neil Armstrong setting foot on the moon. I wish I could have seen it. So my father tells me that there was one night in particular that something was just off. He was looking through his binoculars at stars for a few minutes when he realises that the area around him is slightly too warm. He's not sure whether he's left the heater on, but he goes and checks and nothing's on. He thinks this is odd, and as he steps out again, he realises the stars look different from normal. It's almost like they've moved. He's pretty sure it's just his mind playing games with him, and he's sure not a coward, so he continues searching. As he does so, something very bright appears behind him, almost like somebody's turned on a flashlight. Now initially my dad doesn't know whether it's his eyes messing up or what, but as he turns around, he can see one of the stars floating just above the tree line. He's fixated on this for what feels like an eternity, but was probably only 1 or 2 minutes. While doing so, my dad realises that the warm sensation has come back again. Now, he also realises that there's other lights here and they all seem to be dancing and moving around. My dad wipes his eyes and can't believe what he's seeing, and there's a strange glowing colour coming from the tree line. My dad goes to radio it in, but he can't get anything at all on his radio. It's completely dead, with just static sounds. He can hear some kind of transmission, but it's extremely fuzzy, and he can't really make out words. My dad says he doesn't know what compelled him to do this, but he has to investigate. He still can't believe what he's seeing. He grabs the binoculars and brushes down to head over there. And of course it could be the start of a fire for all he knows. He says as he's walking up towards it, the lights become completely still. And suddenly, nothing. My dad said everything slowly goes black, and all he can remember now is waking up in the early morning. He said when he woke up his face was really hurting him, and looking on a small mirror that he has on a compass in his pocket, he can see that he can't actually see which direction he's going in. The compass is just spinning in circles, and his face is sunburnt. Now this is impossible because he was completely fine the night before, but now, he looks like he's been in the sun for days. His arms are like it too, but especially his face, and it only seems to be on the front side of him. My dad doesn't know exactly what happened, but he must have been out for at least 5 hours because the sun's up now. And what's really strange is near where the trees are, it looks as though lightning struck, but there's no signs of that. The one tree that he saw that thing hovering over is completely dead. Again, not like it's been burnt from lightning, like it's dead, like it hasn't had any leaves on it for at least a year. To this day, my dad still has no idea what happened, and he said he wants to draw it up to his mind playing tricks on him, but there's just too much that doesn't add up here. My dad always loved the stars but never really believed in UFOs or aliens or anything like that, but he's now convinced that there's something out there that's not from this earth. So I used to live near an infamous road. It's a thin road with no street lines, but only a few houses at the end, and lined with thick woods. There were no street lights. We heard stories like ghosts being spotted in the woods, weird beasts and creepy vibes, and a penny throw off a bridge coming back to you. Now my boyfriend and I decided to drive down to it in his car one night. Now my boyfriend has a manual car. The road had several pull-offs where you could park and sit. We pull off at the first one and take some footage of the woods. Nothing happened, so we continued driving to the next pull-off. We parked and shut off the car. We hear some rustling, but both assume that it's probably an animal moving away from the sound of the car. We sat there for a few seconds in the dark of the woods. We then heard something hit the car like a rock or something. We then hear several pounds on the top of the car. At this point we decide to drive off. We try and start the car but to no avail, it stood still. I was freaking out and told him to stop messing around. He then looks at me and says I'm not. While in first gear, he then presses on the gas, beginning to pull away quickly. Against all logic, the car was fighting to go forward against something that wasn't viewable. The tail lights it up, and behind us we can see nothing. Out of nowhere, the car miraculously jumps forward, and we drive off quickly. We try and blow off the experience of not being anything, but it's pretty crazy. We eventually decided to pull off near the bridge and park up. We go to throw a penny for the true experience, and we hear it hit the stream. It doesn't come back. We then look towards the car and can actually see somebody walking towards the back of it. We rush to the car, but there's no sign of anyone. This is the last straw, and we decide to get off the road ASAP. As we're driving away, we hear something else hit the car. This time it sounds like a penny, but we can't be sure. My dad told me this story several times with the context of a weird, cool event that happened to him when he was 10 in the late 1970s, as though he was time traveling. As I got older though, the story really starts to terrify me, especially since when I was younger, I used to go to the same woods to play all the time. So his story started off with him doing normal things that some 10-year-olds might do. Going up to the family forest to play on the outskirts. Mind you, the entire area spanned over 65 acres that we own, but overall it spans miles. He said that it was a normal day and nothing out of the ordinary was happening, until he got to about halfway through the entire woods. He looked into the very far end of our area and heard multiple men's voices coming from inside. My grandfather used to be a farmer, so my dad thought that it could have been one of his uncles. Being curious, he runs over to the woods to investigate. There, he walks into the trees until he comes across an entire logging crew clearing the trees. He said that it was nothing like he's ever seen before, and these men were working and are completely ignoring him as though he's invisible, literally. The other strange thing was that all of the logging trucks and the clothing that the men were wearing appeared to be extremely outdated. He said it was probably 30 or 40 years old at least, potentially more. He starts walking through the area and then tries to ask the men where they come from and who are they. One man finally notices my dad, squats down and says, "What are you doing down here, kid? You need to go back." My dad, very confused, agrees to follow the man back to the edge of the woods. They wave goodbye and my dad starts walking back home. He says all he can remember after that is starting to walk back, but waking up in the middle of the field and the sun's now setting. He's been gone for nearly 2 hours according to his mum, who's been yelling and calling for him for literally hours to come back in, and she's getting worried now. As he normally stayed, never for that long though, she realised something was wrong. The weird thing was that he said it only felt as though he was gone for 10 minutes tops. He never took naps, or he was someone who would never normally take naps too, and that's something else that he found really weird. For some reason, he never felt the need to bring it up until he saw my grandmother. I still don't understand why he never did, and he still to this day doesn't really know that I understand either. He said when he got home, it was like he couldn't really speak at all and he was incredibly drained. As the next few days go by, he told himself that it was probably real and that his dad probably hired people to go out there or something. He said things got really weird though when he went back the following week, and it was as though the men were never there. The trees were not cut, no tyre markings, nothing. So he still didn't bring it up to his folks for some reason. Years later, as an adult in his 30s, he sat down with my grandfather one day over lunch, and somehow, getting on the topic, my dad wanted to ask him a few questions. By this point, my dad was convinced that he either had a very weird dream and really did pass out, or that he had time travelled somehow. To be honest, at this point, he did not really think of it as that strange of a dream. Now there's some questions. He asked my grandfather about the property itself. How many times has it been logged? Among other things involving logging. The biggest thing that stuck out though was that my grandfather told him that about 30 or 40 years ago, before my dad was born, his family had hired a logging company to clear and sell lumber. Nothing super eventful, but it matches almost perfectly to what he saw. Thinking back to my own childhood, there were so many times I went exploring by myself or with my dogs in the same woods. The strangest thing I can ever think of what happened to me was that I would occasionally hear men yelling construction talk, but I always thought it was my neighbours, but they were never there. It sort of sends a chill up my spine thinking about it now. I also found a barbed wire fence mashed into a tree, horseshoes, and old tools that were used for farmland, as well as interestingly shaped natural streams. There's tons of natural cave systems on our property too, which I've managed to find one where one of the streams flows into the underground. It's quite beautiful really, but there's some creepy areas that are entirely empty, dead of everything including weeds, looking as though it's been untouched for decades. When I was 8 years old, we moved to the place that I still live in today. The house lies at the end of a dirt road in a rural village. Surrounding the house are fields and scattered forest patches. Our property is not very large, just the ground directly surrounding the houses. In front of the house is an open grass field with some small tree patches here and there, as well as some higher and lower parts. It's not completely flat. After really thinking about it, it's probably more like a kilometre or so of fields that stop and start with trees in between. Now there must be in total about 4 or so times where I went to explore when I was younger, most of the times with a friend. The last time I'd been there must have been at least 4 years ago. At first glance, the trees seemed to go on for a long time, but already after 50 metres, there is a dirt ridge to the left and right around 2.5 to 2 metres higher. Then all of a sudden, if misplaced, there are a few cabins with no patterns to their positions, scattered over roughly 250 metres with a shallow pond and thick wood on the sides, and between them grass and thin bushes on either side. The whole thing had a rectangle shape, Now we had crossed over the ridge on one of the shorter sides. Now the cabins all look like they're built in the 80s with flat roofs. When we first went there we thought it was odd, but it could have just been an abandoned resort or something. But then we looked through the windows. Inside most of them, they're empty or had things covered in blankets. I remembered thinking it was creepy, but when we found animal remainders all over the land behind the ridge, we got really scared. And we went deeper into it, which was only when we were there the second time. I remembered thinking how odd it was to be there, because there were no signs or anything to mark somebody's property. There weren't any roads to go there to. Now, when we got to the end, it was the last time we went there, because it felt like we were being watched. As we went to leave, I spotted a tall hooded man in dark clothing walking towards us from about 100 meters away, with what appears to be a rifle on his back. My friend and I start running away in the direction of my house, but I can see the man following us. We reach the ridge, but our view of where the man would be is blocked by a cabin. My friend climbs over first and I followed him. We run and don't stop running until we're home again. We never told our parents or anybody else because we don't really want to get in trouble, but it was truly terrifying. Okay, so I have no idea exactly what I saw that night. I have searched everywhere for sightings or even myths around the area we saw it, and I found nothing. If anyone has any idea what we saw, or even if anyone else has seen it, please let me know. My husband and I think it could be a Wendigo, but I'm not sure. Now my friends and I go camping a lot. Our favourite place is Red River Gorge, Kentucky. We go there so often, and I've been there since I was an infant. I'm 28 now, married with a kid, and still go. It is the closest place to where I live that you can actually see the Milky Way pretty much all the time. It's perfect to stargaze, and I've seen a shooting star every clear night that I've been there. When we go without our kid, we will night hike to a good lookout point and stargaze for hours. Our first experiences night hiking, we would go to the trails we knew well, and were used to frequenting during the day. Now the most used trail in the area is one that's known as the Natural Bridge Trail. The trail is around 2 miles uphill depending on your starting point. I've done this trail every summer of my life and could do it blindfolded. It has wooden steps, carved rock steps, long handrails, multiple sitting points under a roof, trash cans, and after reaching the main trail, there's no lights. It's often used, and while it's an uphill one, the difficulty is low. As long as you have a good grip on your shoes and water, you'll be fine. My friends and I have literally done this multiple times, and are confident in it as well. Hiking this trail at night is not allowed, but it's in the woods and I've never really been to one that I've cared about closing times. When we use this main trail to hike to the top, we will park in a lot designated for the pool and Hoden Island. You walk across the road that leads to the pool, and you're at the first trail marker. You go up the gravel for a while and past the Natural Bridge State Park Lodge. There's actually a waterfall and some lights. It's always best to go fast and watch out for rangers that would tell us to leave. Then you walk across another road, and there's a mini shelter to sit on, or a small rock wall that you can rest on. That night, things are normal to begin with. As soon as we started the hike, the clouds took over and it appeared as though we'd been walking for nothing because we can't even stargaze. But we went anyway just in case it cleared out by the time we get up there. In the beginning, it was just normal paranoia that was keeping us stressed and quiet it seemed. You know, you've reached the bottom of the bridge when you see a giant limestone wall. During this time, there was a gazebo that sat to the right of this wall, and the trail continued and followed next to the wall. Where you come from is a fairly steep part of the trail, and the gazebo is welcomed. My husband, my best friend at the time, and I all sit on top of the gazebo. We're all facing down towards the limestone wall now. We each have an LED headlamp and a headlight. We don't usually look at each other because it's blinding, so we sit in a line, like the Lord's Supper, and walk in a line or staggered not to blind ourselves. It is after hours at this point. No ski lift riders have gone for hours and the rangers had already done their sweep, so they're heading back, but we're obviously not. We ended up leaving in no time though, and making sure the trail at the top was clear for our hike up. The ski lift takes you to the top, but there are workers that stay and do counts and only leave once it's clear. I guess I have to make these points because that's what I was thinking when what seemed out of nowhere, a girl with a headlamp appears, beginning to walk down the trail, staring at us. She's in a sundress and flip-flops. The hike's uphill, and while it's easy, you don't want to do it without water or real shoes. She'd have to hike up and down to this point with no food or water. Her light was bright, and when she reaches where the trail turns from in front of the gazebo down to where she comes from, she stops. And she just stands there, kind of eerie. She's looking directly down at us. Her light made my hand light up. Now she doesn't turn away from our lights at all or even react to them. I say hello. She said kind of what sounds like hello, how are you? But I can't make out what it is. I said something like good, and you? She pauses for what feels like an eternity and says, oh, I'm fine. She then just stood there with her hands to the side of her, staring at us. Her light made it impossible to really see her face, and it was so bright I have to put my hands up the entire time. She eventually walked away and slowly turns down the trail. She got to the part where the trail turned and we saw her light just stay in that one spot for a minute, then fading. We wait for a while before continuing up. I kept making comments about how weird that was, and everyone else just made it out to be as though I'm being afraid. But no one ever come after her, which is kind of funny. But she had done this hike alone, at night, and I wasn't sure why. Somehow she hasn't even been detected by any of the park rangers. We got up after a bit and started walking back to the top. It felt like it took much longer than it ever had before in the past, but we make it to the top. They're stones, and they're kind of steep and named Fat Man Squeeze. They get you over to the top of the bridge, and you can walk across it and whatever. Going up and being on the top, we hear twigs snapping, almost alternating from left and right. We lay down and try and stargaze, but the clouds are thicker now, and it's miserably hot. We could hear voices at the same time, and my husband kept checking for people. He never saw anyone. We saw a light flash, but nobody near it. And then a bird call. But it wasn't like a real bird, almost like a person imitating one. Like rhythmic, and not so much natural, if that makes sense. I was convinced that we weren't alone, and hadn't been alone for a while now. I ask if we can leave as soon as possible, and everyone agrees. We began going down the way that we come from, and it felt like it was taking an eternity. We were going steady and quick, and it was downhill, but we're not making any ground, it seemed. It's hard to explain, but it was weird. I even said aloud, this feels much longer than it should be, and they agree with me. I kept looking behind me with the flashlight, and my husband kept looking out to the sides, and my friend kept hers mostly forward. I kept feeling watched and can't figure out what footsteps are ours or the others. I would turn around in the direction of a noise and see nothing. When my husband was walking, kept saying he was catching eyes with something in his flashlight. Usually you can see a raccoon spying on you, but not this time. He's afraid maybe it's a big dog or bear. And I could never see it when he did. Now, we're hiking down semi-panicking on a kind of flattish area compared to the normal downhill areas that we're used to. The log fence or handrail, whatever it's called, is on our right. We are in a row walking within reaching distance from the barrier, and my husband just stops walking altogether and says, "What's that?" But the question is more of an alert. I move my headlamp in the direction that he's pointing to and see nothing. But then, both his lights catch a shape. My headlamp catches the shape too. It's almost simultaneous. All lights fixate on this grey creature. It is bent in a crouching position, knees facing out to the right, turning towards us. It starts to slowly stand, and my mind is racing. It looks human, but it's far too big. People mistake human shapes for what's actually bears in the woods, but this is shiny. It's thin and big, almost like it's too big and too grey. There's a shine to it, and our lights reflect it even more. It gradually comes to a standing position. Its head is long, and its eyes are in a human position, but it's not human whatsoever. It doesn't have normal eyes, just big empty holes. It looks directly at us. The way it stood up was intimidating, almost like it was a snake, and it appears smart. It was like it was stepping up to a fight, from crouching to accepting a challenge. Its hands had to be by its knees. It must have stood about 8 or 9 feet tall. No hair whatsoever, and its head was large. I can't process what I saw, and I was frozen. Then, I can just feel my husband hitting me saying, "Run, please." I start to understand that we have to get away from this thing, and it pivots and runs to the right. Going backwards on the trail so it could get around the barrier and onto the trail behind us. We take off the rest of the way running down the trail, knowing that this thing could take off so much quicker than us and get to the barrier so quick. We didn't talk much at all because we felt so scared. We kept running as far as we could. It never felt like we're even out of sight of this thing, let alone reaching distance. As we made it to the trail beginning with the gravel, we could hear something to the right side crashing down through the forest. We run to the road and get to the car, driving off as quick as we possibly can. When that thing looked at us, I knew immediately it was much stronger, smarter and faster than us. I knew that if we hadn't seen it, it could have taken one of us at least. I think it only hesitated because there's such a big group of us. When we made it back, we were all terrified, trying desperately to figure out what we saw, but none of us can make sense of it. I was born and raised in the hills of eastern KY, about 10 miles from Hazard. When I was about 14 to 15, my cousin and I went hiking, going to the top of one of the mountains. We followed a trail, sometimes almost straight up, and what we saw terrifies both of us. We had been walking for about an hour and a half, when we saw a man and woman's clothes on a tree limb. That might not sound strange, but we were far from people, and the branch was at least 30 feet off the ground. The clothes were neatly draped over the branch like they'd been not thrown up there. We ended up going further, and eventually found a flat area. There's no trees, no grasses or flowers. Now, off to my left, I remembered seeing a black hole in the air. Not shiny, like the mouth of a cave, just black. It was 8 foot tall, and 3 feet wide, and kind of misty around the edges. Seems like every year, the memory fades a little, so the next thing I remember is tearing down the side of the mountain as quick as possible, not following the trail, just trying to get away from whatever it was. To this day, I have no idea what it was, but I'm sure there was a connection between the people's clothes missing and that. I've been lurking here for a few months, but decided to tell my story finally. My family and I are from Oakland, CA. It was 2012. I was 16 and my brother was 12, and my parents are both in their mid-50s. One summer, we were on a road trip and ended up camping in the mountains above Lander, WY. I remembered sitting in the back seat behind my dad who was driving. We're on a dirt road above Sinks Canyon. All of the windows are open. It's July and really nice out. We pulled over by the turnout to one of the lakes to the right of us to take a look at the map. My parents weren't sure about how to get to the campground on the other end. It's quite a few miles away. About this time, a young lady came jogging from the other direction. I remembered she was blonde, had a yellow tank top and dark shorts. My dad waved out the window to call to her. He said we're lost and said, "Do you know the area?" "Yeah, sure do, if you keep following this," she mentions. "It will take you to Louise Lake. The campground's to your left." We thank her and she says she's Amy. Anyway, a few years later, I see an episode of Disappeared that featured a young runner who had gone missing in the 90s outside of Lander, WY, and I immediately get chills. Apparently she was never found. They show her picture, and the hairs on the back of my neck immediately stood up. It's her, and her name's Amy. When we saw her, she appeared to be the same age, even wearing the same clothes in the program. I showed my dad a few days later, but he didn't remember specifics. He remembered her being called Amy, but that was it. My brother was asleep when this happened, and my mum had no comment. But I know what I saw. It was Amy. Now, I'm not religious, which makes this story harder for me to understand, but the rest of my family is, and for some reason, my mum and dad were still together, and they prayed when riding the bus. That was just a habit they had. We lived in Finland out in the woods a bit, and strange things aren't really that common here. This happened before I was born. I was in the womb. My mum and dad got on the bus, and noticed a tall, slim, dark thing sitting behind the driver. It's wearing all black robes. Now they can see because it's darker where the tree line is, and it almost stands out as being pitch black compared to the surroundings. To this day, they don't know if it was male or female. They sat a couple of seats behind the thing, and as usual start praying. My mum noticed the head of the thing start to shiver and jolt lightly. She didn't mind it, but the more she prayed, and the further into the forest the bus drove, that thing seemed to get more agitated. My mum shivers when she speaks about it. She has had so many nightmares about this thing. My mum started getting a weird feeling. My dad didn't care as much, he's used to weirdos, but the jolting intensifies, and the long greasy hair, barely holding on the top of the head, starts whipping. The thing then starts growling and hissing. Suddenly, it stopped. Its head turns all the way around and stared with its soulless and dark eyes straight at my mum. A wave of panic overtook her as she started frantically pressing the stop button. They get off and my dad said, "What is it?" My mum explained the whole thing, but my dad brushes it off. Said that there's full of weird people on this bus. But here's a kicker. My mum often has visions and they're often true. She once saved a guy from committing suicide and had a vision of his chair he was sitting on just before he jumped off a roof. She also saw his face in the vision. She knew where he was going to jump. He said afterwards that he told God that if somebody doesn't speak to him, he'll die. Back to the story. My mum saw a vision of the thing standing in front of their door and she freaked out and refuses to go home. But my dad, in his nature, dragged my mum along and ensured her it's going to be alright, and how ridiculous the vision is. I bet you know where this is going. They got home, and sure enough, the thing was right there, right in front of their door. They freaked out, ran for their lives, and escaped into a bar calling the priest. He said that under no circumstances did they touch or even go near that thing ever. They waited in the bar for hours and finally noticed the thing's gone. They then had the priest come and purify their house. I went out hiking into the wilderness on the outskirts of Yuma and walked about 5 miles from my car to my campsite. I brought my usual hiking gear along, as well as my AR-15 for protection against wild animals like coyotes and snakes. My firewood supply burned up just after the sun went down. I went to bed at 18:30. I messed around on my phone until 19:30, passed out, and I'm then woken up by a call by my friend. Now it's around 8:30, and I fell asleep again. The next time I woke up, I couldn't move. I could hear rocks moving around outside and soft footfalls in the sand right outside my tent. I heard coyotes howling louder earlier, so I know that's what they were. I was sleeping with my back against the wall, and one of them idiots presses their noses in my back and sniffs me for a good few minutes. The second thing that happened was around 0300. This is a nightmare. Not sleep paralysis this time. There are 2 sections of my tent that can be seen through. It had to be a dream, but I woke up, peered through the window, and I saw a young woman and child sitting outside my tent on a small rise, no more than 6 feet away. I asked who they are. The child was silent, but the woman declared, "Leave now." They made a horrifying face. I was able to grab my gun. I tried to shoot them. Because it dawned on me that something was terribly wrong, the trigger wouldn't budge. She then stood up and walked into the shrubs. The woman walks away until I can't see her anymore, but the child passed out from under the moonlight into the shadow of the shrub tree, and because the moonlight was falling on the other side of the tree, all I could do is watch her silhouette change shape. She'd become a gnarly, bony freak, almost like a tall monkey. Absolutely silently, she rushed my tent. I squeezed the trigger for all that I'm worth. She collides with my tent. In that instant, I'm throwing punches everywhere, and everything goes back to normal. Now, the crazy thing too is on the way back, I find there's scratch marks all over my car, and on the back of my arms. I've never had anything like this before in my life. My husband and I love to go driving. We prefer road trips, but on the weekends or nights, we have nothing better to do than to go around cruising and just drive around. We prefer smooth and not busy roads. On this particular night, we are bored and decide to go cruising. We went up north to a small town, about half an hour from the city where the roads are curvy and smooth. This town is close to the mountains, and if you follow this particular path to the main street all the way up north, it starts driving up a mountain. It's about 9 PM, and there are very few cars in the road already since it's a little cute town. But we kept going north anyway from the houses and stores, and eventually to where the roads start curving uphill. We drive up for about 15 minutes more, and it's pitch black when we see some blinking lights. As we get closer, we see a truck that's on the side of the road facing us. I'm getting the chills thinking about being all the way up there in the middle of nowhere, and a stranded truck on the side of the road appears. As we slowly approach, I tell my husband it's probably best to turn back. I have a bad feeling, but at this point, we're pretty much at the truck. He pulls up next to us. We see that there's a young blonde guy, probably in his late 20s, who gets up to our window. I get such a bad vibe by this and tell my husband not to put his window down. I think he also gets a weird vibe and actually listens to me. He kinda just loudly asks what's wrong, and the guy just says something happened to his truck and he needs a hand. His phone is dead. Now my husband asks what happened, but this guy insists on showing him and to take a look. He says it's very friendly and even calls him bro, and he's glad we pulled up. My husband says, you know what, I won't be much help because I know nothing about cars, but I can call help for ya. My friend knows a lot about cars. The guy's insisting and gets upset. I'm now looking back at the truck, and I thought I caught movement inside the truck. I tell my husband I think we should go. Now, he probably saw the look of fear on my face because he puts the car in reverse, but as he did, the guy is now behind our car, so my husband decides to go forward instead. We drive up for maybe 2 minutes, trying to find a place to turn around since the road is so narrow. The road turns to a dirt road, and there's a little more space on the side, so he's able to turn the car around. I am dreading going back that way now, and our phones have no signal at all. In my mind, I know this could all be someone with genuine problems, but this doesn't make sense. I cannot help the feeling in my gut. We soon reach the area where the truck had been, and there's no truck at all. We drive maybe another 5 minutes, no trace of one whatsoever, and we're sure we've passed the place that he said. We didn't drive up too far to begin with. I am both relieved and terrified that the truck's no longer there though. If it had really broke down, how did it get help working again in such a short amount of time? Calming myself down, I'm telling my husband, hey, maybe they really did get it to work. Maybe it turned on all of a sudden and they drove off. Suspicious, yeah, but not impossible. As we keep driving through, the roads begin to straighten out. We notice far off the truck with all the lights off, and park to the side again and notice movement in the truck. I say out loud, why did they turn out all the lights? I think they were thinking we're still far enough away from them, but we see 2 figures get on the other side of the truck and crouch down as if hiding. We get closer and my husband floors it. As we drive past, the 2 men get up. One of them is the guy that we had spoken to earlier, and the other's massive. With a very surprised look in their faces, one of them turns and runs behind us trying to catch us. I kept looking back, but it's so dark. Now all of a sudden, I see the headlights in their truck, and they start driving in our direction very fast. My husband keeps going, and eventually, we lose the headlights. I kept looking back the rest of the way, so scared that they're somehow still following us. Maybe they turned off their lights again and I can't see them. Anyway, after driving for a very long time back to the city, we're convinced no one's following us now. We do call the non-emergency line given a description, but we don't get the plates, so it's pretty much futile doing so, just given a description of the guys we saw. I realise all this could be rationalised, but it makes no sense why one guy was hiding and how they tried desperately to follow us. I hate the fact that they're still out there. I just pray we never encounter them again. I don't know if this is an Eastern Coast thing, but in my little town, there's a twice the ice station. Basically, you fill up water jugs and get ice bags for cheaper than you can in the grocery store. I went out a few nights ago to get some water, because hey, He wants to be drinking tap water. My husband was home, and because I'm kind of heavily pregnant, he insisted that he go instead, but I really wish that he would have done. I was out at 1 AM, and it's dark for miles in the middle of nowhere. As I get out of my car, I open the back seat to get the gallon jugs and close the door. The moment I do, a dark blue truck van pulls up behind me. I presume that they're doing the same thing as me, and I don't really think too much of it. However, alarm bells start going off, and the alarm bells start screaming at me when the slide door opens up and two large men step out. It's about a 20-foot distance between me and them, so the first thing I do is pull out my phone and start making a pretend phone call saying, "Yeah, I'm almost home." As soon as they see me answer, one guy says "crap," and they both get in there, tires literally screeching as they bolt out of there. I throw the jugs into my car, empty, and lock all the doors 1,000,000 times before I broke down calling my husband. He told me to write down the make and model of the car and colour, and we'd go to the police station first thing tomorrow. Now I don't know if they targeted me because I was a woman alone in the middle of nowhere, but deep down, I know they targeted me because I was pregnant, and I don't want to think what would have happened if they got me. When I was 16, some friends and I went to an outdoor centre concert thing. We parked to the mall and took a shuttle to the venue. For perspective, the mall is a 20-minute drive from our home, and the venue's another 20 minutes away in a different direction. During the concert, I end up losing my friends in the crowd. I don't care though, as I wanted to get to the front, and I could just call them after the concert ends. Well, of course I lost my phone somewhere in the crowd of people, and don't even notice until the last show wraps up. I search the ground as the people dissipate with no luck. Reluctantly, I just hop on the bus heading back to the mall, hoping to meet them at the car. The car is gone, and I start to freak out a little, but it's 10 PM when I head to the bus station to see when the next bus is coming. Just my luck, it's a special holiday, so no buses until 10 AM. I borrow a stranger's phone and call the two numbers I know, my mum and brother. My mum doesn't answer, but my brother does. He basically gives me the suck it up talk and hangs up. So I'm alone, scared, and a little drunk in a city I don't know. I try walking but quickly give up when I realise I'm basically walking down a random highway towards God knows where. Back at the station, I'm just staring at the map when a stranger creeps up behind me. He asks me where I'm heading, and I say the truth. He is conveniently going to the same city, asking if I'd take a split to a cab. Realising this is my only option, as I said I don't have my own money, we get in the car. Turns out he has less than I do. We barely have enough to get to the heart of the city, which is a 10-minute drive from my home, but at least I know my way from there. During the drive, this guy gets progressively more creepy. He's aware that I'm 16 and he's 25. He scoots closer every minute, touching me, insisting I come back with him, even writing his number on my leg. As we get there, I realise the situation I'm in. We're about to get out at a quiet area at 2 AM, and the cabbie's gonna drive off, leaving no one to hear me scream. The second he gets out, I turn to the driver begging him to take me further, so I can at least put some distance between us. The cab driver said he hadn't heard a word the whole way, but definitely heard something odd. He asked me for my address and takes me all the way home, and the creeper stares in frustration as he drives off. When I got home, I offered to wake up my mum to pay him, but he declined, saying he's just glad I'm safe. I broke in through the kitchen window to get to bed and cried myself to sleep. I'm just glad the cab driver was so kind to me